The First Cut, written and read by Kieran Marsden. So where do I begin? By saying the coolness of that September morning air echoed the melancholy in my heart, or that in the laughter only teenage cruelty could be heard? Well, let me set the scene most efficiently. I was a virgin. I was 17 years old and on my first day of college. I was wearing a black Led Zeppelin t-shirt, a pair of black Converse trainers, and in between was a pair of skinny jeans covering skinny legs. I looked dirty, without actually being dirty. It's what we called emo at the time. What that actually meant, I still haven't got a clue. I really didn't look like the kind of guy that was beginning a sports course, but I always have been something of an anomaly. It was the first of many bush journeys. In ways, it was the first day of my life. They were dark days, outside and in. All of us on that bus trapped between adulthood and childhood. Adult enough to be needlessly cruel, yet child enough to use words rather than fists to cause our destruction. I cringe to think of the effects on some people's psyches. Even now, a decade later, I believe some will still be in recovery, living a needlessly self-conscious life because of some stupid jokes some kids made. In some ways, I think only the English can be so cruel, caught between European idealism and the American dream, but doomed to realise neither, so we vent our frustration through art and anguish. Buildings are tall, aren't they? Said Cambridge to Darren Lacey, who had opened up about his depression. Of course, everybody laughed. The awkward atmosphere he had bestowed upon us was not welcome. That's how it was on that bus every day. Teenage ignorance laughed at everything, but I think there was a sadness burning deep inside every stomach. The bus journey to college was 45 minutes long, out of the misery of our small town into a more vibrant misery 20 miles away. After the bus had pulled into the station and killed its engine, we started walking up the hill towards the college. Optimism warmed us just a little on that first day, echoing the sun that crept out from grey clouds. Flocks of teenagers with rucksacks and expensive trainers dispersed into smaller friendship groups, and I found myself beside one of my best friends, Adam Wolfe. Nobody ever called him Adam. His name was Wolfie. Young or old, friend or foe, he was Wolfie. He epitomised, and still does, Mr. Nice. Everybody in town knows him, and he knows everything about everyone. He loves gossip. Not in a malicious way. He just loves to know what's going on. Curiosity is his catnip, and it hasn't killed him yet. I can see his eyes now growing large if I was to tell him something new, a little secret nobody knows. Even to this day I still consider him one of my best friends. As I write these words, he's expecting his second child to the woman he loves. How times change. Where was I? Oh yes, walking to college on our first day. I can't exactly remember what was discussed, and I barely remember seeing the college for the first time. Back then it was a complex of 3 buildings, one modern, one old, and one decaying. The decaying one was the sports building. It would be, wouldn't it? My first real memory of college is sat in a cold gymnasium with roughly 20 other teenagers. New faces on cheap chairs aligned in a circle, forcing us all to look at one another, forcing us to judge. It was the infamous icebreaker, and looking around it was a group of misfits. We literally was. The way it worked was we were arranged into sports academies. So a student who had joined the football academy, for example, was in a class with people from the football academy. But the people in our class had joined no academy, and you could really tell there was an aesthetic difference. There was a male model, a rapper, a blonde girl with big you-know-what, a rock guy, that was me remember, the Led Zeppelin top. But as for the other classes, they were all carbon copies of each other. The same tracksuits, the same walks, the same damn haircuts, and that same feeling of superiority founded upon nothing. I don't remember everyone's icebreaker, I just remember 2. The idea was to introduce the person beside you, and one fact about them. I was next to Wolfie, and so he proceeded. "Hello everybody, this is Daniel Mercury, and he's a Nazi," said Wolfie with a wide smile. There was a silence. Wolfie had fired his joke and missed the target, and I was paying the price. There was 2 problems with what Wolfie had said. The first was ignorance. Most 17-year-olds aren't exactly sure what a Nazi is or what one looks like. They just know they're bad, and since I looked a bit different to them, perhaps I was a Nazi. The second problem was, it just wasn't funny. But the fact remained, 40 eyes looked at me with a disdain. There wasn't even a "I'm joking" from Wolfie. He just let me hang there like a war criminal, like a Nazi. Anyhow, the teacher awkwardly moved things on. Now, I don't believe in love at first sight, but Hi, I'm Priscilla Carter, but everybody calls me Price, she said, sitting alone. There was an innocence emanating from her, and something I had never experienced took hold. The world disappeared, and I was looking at somebody I knew but had never met. Her skin was olive-like, perhaps sun-kissed from a holiday in the Mediterranean. Her thick shoulder-length brown hair shimmered, and green eyes smiled like a tame jaguar. She smiled at the teacher, revealing pink braces and joy. "Why Price?" said the teacher. "I'm not sure. Maybe it's because my mum likes expensive things," she said, gently, making the class laugh. There was a trace of makeup around her eyes, but her natural beauty ruled supreme, and it had me captivated. There was a confidence in her voice, but also a vulnerability. It was revealed in a small smile and lost hands. The teacher in the focus of the room moved on, but I didn't. This girl had spoken more loudly to me than anything I'd ever heard. I don't remember any more of that day, but my mind had been altered. No longer was I a concoction of vague dreams and hopes and ideas. There was something tangible, and she had green eyes and a pink smile. I floated onto the bus that evening in a daydream I never wanted to leave. My headphones were in, but I didn't really listen to the music. It was just background noise to a picture in my mind. And though I couldn't hear the laughter on the bus, that day I would have only heard love. The next morning, our new class sat together, and people began to pair up and make acquaintances. People gravitated towards people similar to themselves, which wasn't easy in a class of teenage all sorts. We were handed our timetables, and more was explained, how the year was to be, and all the boring stuff. After an hour, we were allowed to go, and the day was over for most, but not for me. Before the course had started, I had agreed to retake my maths GCSE. Stupid idea, since I failed it at school, getting a D. Don't get me wrong, maths has never been my strong point, but I put it down to spraining my wrist while playing football in the playground before the test. It meant I had to do it left-handed, and my answers essentially became unreadable scribbles. So I said goodbye to Wolfie and watched my new class disperse. I remember standing outside the sports building beneath a beautiful blue September sky. I could feel the sun warming my skin and the lightest of breezes providing me a little refreshment. But there was a problem. Everything was right, but I felt wrong. Back then, I wasn't used to being by myself. Independence was a new notion to this 17-year-old, and it had me stumped. And then, like it had all been planned, along came a welcome face from the sports building behind me. It was Price. She walked towards me and revealed her pink braces with a small smile. I became very conscious of the way I was sitting and what my hands were doing. "Hey, it's Daniel, right?" she said, wearing a small white vest top and tight-fitting black tracksuit bottoms. The vest was revealing so much of that golden skin. She was a picture of health and youth. To me, she almost looked like life itself. "That's me. Price, isn't it?" I said, trying not to sound too sure. "Yeah. Why are you alone?" she said, walking up and sitting right beside me. And I mean, right beside me. I've always felt a little weird when people touch me or get too close, but with her, I didn't mind. Her hip was against mine, and I couldn't believe how close she was, how confident she was. Her body language and tone of voice seemed like she didn't have a care in the world. "I have to go to maths class at 3. "Really? That's crap. I have to wait for my sister. She goes to Queen's, and I have to wait for her to finish so we can get the train back together." "Queen's? You know, Queen Elizabeth School?" "The school up there?" she said, pointing towards the cathedral behind the college, then looking at me like I had some mental deficiency. "I'm not from round here, I'm from Gatesborough," I said. "Oh, right," said Price, raising an eyebrow, looking at me a little surprised. "Let me tell you now more about my hometown. Not long after starting college, I found out it had a reputation for being a little rough. Personally, I don't think that's any truer than any other place, but it's small, so the rough ones shine a little more brightly. Big fish in a small bowl comes to mind. Well, Queen's is a lot better than the rest of the schools in this city," she continued, sounding a little pompous. Sorry, correction, very pompous. "Nice one," I replied simply. Under the blue sky, time flew away and the barriers came down, and before I knew it, it was time for my maths class. The idea of leaving her almost hurt. At that moment, I didn't care for any teachings except for the ones that spilled from her mouth. "I guess you should go get your class," she said. I wanted to say I didn't want to go, but I didn't want to sound crazy. "You're walking to the bus station after, right?" she said, looking at her hands. "Yeah, I will be." "Shall I meet you here after your class? I need to walk that way anyway. I'm meeting my sis at the train station. If you want to, I said, trying to keep cool. Then something happened I didn't expect. As we stood up, she gave me a hug. To you, that may seem trivial, but to a simple teen from the rough streets of Gatesborough, who had only ever been kissed by one girl, it was a really bizarre yet beautiful thing at the same time. See you later, said Price, turning and moving away with a skip. Only one thing happened in that maths class. I thought of Price. She was the only equation I seemed to care about. She had become the E equals mc squared, and I wanted to be at Einstein. I meandered out of the classroom, none the wiser on mathematics, walking down the steps of the building towards the front door and held my breath. And there she was, stood outside the college entrance, just like she said she would be. With a tentative smile on her face, she looked at me in the cool September evening light. How bad was it? She asked as we walked away together towards the bus station. I had noticed throughout the day she had a peculiar disposition, something between confidence and self-conscience, and it had me captivated. It kept me hooked on her every move, like a novel or a movie that you have no idea where it's going. What she did next tightened that stranglehold. Watch this, she said with a mischievous glimmer in her eye. I will make him like me, she said, looking at a lone teenage man on the opposite side of the road. She began to walk a little faster, stopping just before it became a skip. His eyes met hers and she fluttered her eyelashes while playing with a strand of hair, twirling it around her forefinger and looking at him seductively. I then imagined the bonnet of a car speeding and colliding into the back of him, his head whipping back and his skull shattering the windscreen. His body then tumbling over like a rag doll and just lying there, with limbs in all an unnatural way, silent yet so perfectly still. But that didn't happen. The innocent guy just glanced her way and quickly looked down as he continued his journey. Her face dropped, and she looked disgusted with his lack of engagement, and told me something must be wrong with him, sounding somewhat embarrassed. That told me more about her. I was to find out in the coming weeks that Price wasn't normal. Most would conclude Price was somewhat crazy. Not in a nasty way, that was to become common knowledge in our class. And I was about to discover much about myself. This new stimulus was to evoke a certain side of me that had lied dormant all my life. I was about to discover I was crazy too, but not in a good way. "10 years later, I sometimes walk past that college sports building and look at where it all happened. It's changed. It's now a beautiful piece of architecture, looking like a crystal reaching into the sky, and behind it another beauty emanates. The city's ancient cathedral rises up and looks over the college. It was a little different in my day. The sports building was half the size, and only a single sheet of glass provided little purpose. It was always cold. At the top of the building, on the third floor, was the teachers' offices. On the second floor was the classrooms and a computer room in the centre. This computer room was the heart of the building, and always full of teenagers joking and laughing and doing little work as possible. So I guess we should say above was the brains, but I believe as little work got done there, and there's probably just as many jokes, mostly aimed at the students, probably the same kind of jokes we got told off for. I remember one day walking into that central computer room and seeing a lot of young faces and eyes glued to screens in front of them. She was there, closest to the door. I remember her green eyes slowly looking into mine. There was a moment's pause and an intensity. I don't know who broke that silence, but I never wanted to quite escape it. "Hey," she said, with a smile from the side of her mouth and with eyes that flicked quickly to my feet and back. "Hello," I said, simply, trying hard to subdue the smile that demanded to be seen. I took a free chair and sat beside my new friend. I really couldn't stop smiling, but I couldn't find anything to say, but somehow that was all okay. She was on the same website as everybody else, but nobody's screen was quite the same. It was MySpace. Each had a different coloured background with pictures of themselves trying to look effortlessly cool. But then, they didn't look so bad. The social media rules had not been yet established, but I'm sure if them same people was to look back now, if they looked at them old pictures, they would die from embarrassment. Then Price asked me, "Do you have the Facebook yet?" "What?" "The Facebook. Look," she said, opening a new tab, then typing away on the keyboard. Then it opened, and that was the first time I ever saw it. My first impression was it looked somehow boring and blue. It didn't mean anything to me. I had no idea it would change everything. Nonchalantly, she showed me pictures of herself, and that's when I saw him. pale skin, long black hair, and his hands on Price. So, she had a boyfriend. It was a dagger in the heart, and for the first time, I tasted this new Facebook and what it could do, invading our emotions wherever it wanted to. Price began to tell me more about him, especially how she loved him. In the pictures, I could see them kissing and touching. Then something terrifying dawned upon me. The dagger was drawn from my heart, and a shotgun was forced into my mouth and pushed up against my tonsils. I realised Price was no virgin. I hadn't even thought about that until then, and as I looked at her at that moment, all the innocence was washed away. She changed. She became unattainable and vaster in my eyes. She became a woman. I felt like a lost little boy looking at the screen of two perfect faces laughing at me. Then I imagined her boyfriend as a corpse in the woods. My head went down that day, and misery kept my mouth shut as I sat beside Wolfie waiting for our last lecture. We sat on the steps outside the sports building and soaked up the last drops of sun before autumn came to take them away. As we relaxed, Price and a girl called Shania McBride walked towards us. Price appeared completely different to me now. In her skip, I didn't see something pure and beautiful anymore and tainted by life. I saw someone being poisoned by its sick white poison that had turned her ill. I could see she craved life's sticky essence, just like nature demanded, skipping and smiling, trying to tantalise all the boys for a taste of their brand. But that wasn't true. She was just a 17-year-old girl and I was sulking. Shania, her friend, was small and ginger and wore glasses that magnified her eyes, making them look super huge. She came across as delicate and innocent and spoke with a softness that epitomised her. "You guys all right?" said Price, with a casualness that surprised me. "Not bad, just killing time, you know. Before next class," said Wolfie, sitting up slightly in the presence of women. There was a little needless chit-chat thrown back and forth, and I was still licking my wounds from the early revelation. Then Price said, "You're a virgin, aren't you?" she said to me. Shania laughed. It wasn't an accusing laugh, but one at Price, of complete surprise of her unforgiving accusation. Wolfie smiled. He couldn't believe it too. He also loved this kind of thing. I felt my cheeks burning. How embarrassing. The problem was that when I went red, I went red. I had fallen victim to the craziness that captivated me. I was telling myself to keep calm and hoping my biology was on my side and got the memo, not to turn my cheeks a glowing red stop sign. "I think it's the way you sit. Look, your friend has his legs wide open, he's laid back. He just looks more confident than you." I didn't even know how I was sitting, and before I was allowed to respond or even comprehend, she was walking away. Shania stood there a little longer, looking over her glasses, and she was laughing at me now, or hopefully with me. Then Wolfie laughed too. "Jesus, she's a character." "Well, what's wrong with the way I sit?" I said, feeling the heat ease away from my cheeks. "I don't know. I wouldn't listen to her. It was just a lucky guess," said Wolfie, as I sat back a little further. The first week of college passed into history, and I discovered my heart wasn't as dormant as I once thought. The long summer evenings were becoming shorter, and it was my first weekend since college had begun. I noticed then a peculiar disposition. No longer was home the central point of my life. I wanted to be back at college, where my hungry heart could eat. At home, my dilemmas played evil games in my mind, conjuring up images and issues that didn't actually exist. Awful innocence hung to me like a ball and chain. The fact this girl called Price didn't know about my dilemma somehow hurt more. I pictured her at home with my other dilemma, and how she was probably playing with it. Maybe she'd mentioned me. Maybe together naked in bed they laughed about me, while I sat at my parents' blue sofa eating chili con carne and looking into the hungry eyes of our pet dog. That weekend I thought I had a good idea. I convinced myself it would suit my rocker look and give me an edge. Writing this 10 years later, and a little wiser, I know the real reason. It was because he had black hair. So I went to the local supermarket and I picked up a bottle of hair dye called Blackest Black. I have looked back at the couple of pictures in existence of me with long black hair. They almost always draw a laugh from the person sat beside me. There's nothing wrong with black hair, it just didn't suit me. But at that time, when I looked in the mirror, I was in awe. My hair was beyond black. It glimmered almost indigo blue when the light caught it just right. My mum smiled. She didn't know what to say. My sister smiled too and said it looked cool. As I looked at my reflection, I felt somehow my innocence had been removed. I literally was looking at a darker me, one that would turn up at college on Monday with a newfound respect. In theory. I turned up to the bus station in the dark morning and was met by the odd stare. Beneath bus shelters, faces I knew but people I didn't whispered, but I breezed past them without a care. I've always thought little of people's opinions on issues aesthetic. I like my own conclusions. Only one other opinion really mattered: prices. I remember walking into the computer room that morning, her head turning and her green eyes widening her gaze and her mouth opening, slightly revealing pink braces. "Whoa," said Price. I remember feeling smug as I sat beside her on the computer. "When did you do that?" "Saturday night," I said, acting casual, logging into the computer. I could feel her eyes on me. "I think it looks amazing," she said. I couldn't help but smile. My cheeks defied my mind and revealed my teeth in pleasure. "I think you look hot," she whispered, so people who weren't listening couldn't hear. I looked at her and gave her a coy smile. I could see the genuine pleasure in her eyes. Looking back, I'm sure she genuinely did find me more attractive. Was it the different colour? I think not. I looked less attractive regarding the typical definition of good looking. I think what attracted her was I looked different. In a building where everyone walks around in tracksuits and trainers and gelled hair, I was in denim and dirty Converse. The black hair just solidified that style which she happened to like, and I happened to like her too. Many a time that day I looked at Price, and she was looking at me. She would quickly look away, but I knew she would be staring again shortly. I meandered around the college that day with a quiet confidence and pleasure. On our last lesson, that day the teacher decided to make the most of the fading summer sun. He had taken us to the local park to do a bleep test. Now, for anybody who doesn't know what the bleep test is, it is simply running back and forth between 2 points at a distance of 20 metres every time there is a bleep. The time between the bleeps gets shorter, and if you can't make it to the next point before the next beep, you're out. Understood? It's a common test among athletes who are normally running on well-exercised cardiovascular systems, in other words, healthy hearts. Well, I was about to discover that doing one on an aching heart had its advantages too. The class and I had lined up on that long straight pavement that ran through the centre of the park. On either side of us, beautiful trees lined the tarmac corridor, forming a canopy above us. Lots of bright lights shone through bronzing leaves that anticipated autumn and lit up the pavement ahead. 20 metres ahead, we could see the yellow cone awaiting us, where we would wait for the next bleep. Then the teacher counted us in. 3, 2, 1, go, he said, pressing play on the cassette. It sounded a very deep computerised beep from a speaker and we were off. At first, it was steady. Everyone could easily handle the pace, and we all casually jogged together. I remember behind me was a guy called Jester, appropriately named as he was the class clown. He laughed at my long hair bouncing up and down as we ran. I remember laughing too, no point in making it more embarrassing. The beeps got faster, and soon people were dropping off quite quickly. I was beginning to sweat. Me and the 5 remaining others really had to sprint now before the next beep set us off immediately. The rest of the class watched as they sat at the grass at the side, gasping, as those remaining few battled it out. We were really running now. Lactic acid in the legs burnt, and a few more dropped out. Quicker and quicker the beeps got, and only I and another remained. The last guy against me would go on to be a Marine, so you can imagine what I was up against. We were sprinting. Bleep, back again. Sweat. Bleep. My legs were beginning to give up, and my lungs burnt. Bleep, I needed air. Bleep. Mr. Marine didn't look so bad as I glanced his way. I took a deep breath and thought about ending it all. Then I got something sweeter than oxygen. Price was cheering me on. "Go on, Daniel!" she shouted. Her simple words were fuel, igniting my inner grit. There was no chance I was giving up, as wonderful green eyes watched me. My cheeks burned a brighter red, and my legs were almost collapsing. But words, yes, words kept me moving. "Beep! Don't give in, Daniel!" shouted Price. Then I noticed something. Mr. Marine. He had disappeared from my side, and as I looked back, he had eased away to the grass and collapsed. I was running alone. I reached the cone, and then, beep! I turned, and I was running back towards my entire class. They all watched, but I wasn't over. No, I needed to impress a girl. Another beep rang, and I pushed hard into the concrete, and back again. A couple more beeps rang, until my legs finally collapsed, and I could take no more. I rolled into the grass, panting, and looking up into the blue sky, feeling sick. She ran up beside me, and I looked into her eyes. There it was. I could see it in her eyes. That 4-letter word beginning with L. Lust. The teacher soon said we could leave for home, so the majority of the class began to walk back towards the college. I and Wolfie were heading that way too. And though he didn't say anything, I could see a glimmer of pride that his Gatesborough brother had beaten all the others from the big city. There was one person's pride who shined even more evidently. and she was walking about 20 metres ahead. There was no beep, but I wanted to run to her. Price was walking with Shania, and she kept glancing over her shoulder. Wolfie was speaking, but all I could hear was Price. As we approached the college, there he was. He sat on a blue BMX, and she ran to him. He was very tall, and he leaned over and hugged his girlfriend. "I guess that's the boyfriend then," said Wolfie, as I pictured his corpse in the woods and his skin turning black. I didn't look at Wolfie. I didn't want to see his gossip boy smile. I tried not to look at them either. I tried to look like I didn't care, but Wolfie knew I liked her. I will never know, but I'm sure Price was watching me as I passed by. I'm sure she was wondering what I was thinking. If she knew how dark my thoughts were, at that moment, she might not have wanted to know me in the morning. But that's the beauty of thoughts. Nobody ever knows what you're really thinking. Days and classes passed and people made new friends. I was learning very little about sport, but discovering a lot about life. In fact, I don't think I ever learned anything academically. Ever. The course just offered new relationships, which is where the real learning is. It was just fuel for me to philosophize and ponder the meaning of life. I have always been something of a daydreamer. Academia has always somewhat dissatisfied me. Sitting down quietly and listening to an opinion, later reciting it well enough so you receive a certificate saying you can comprehend someone else's ideas. I personally believe the real intellect lies in creativity, to think and to imagine what others do not dare. Obeying and relaying all already established idea has always seemed like a strange definition of education to me. Where's the thinking part? But that's a discussion for another day. To summarise, I don't recall anything about the course, I just remember the people. Anyway, on one of those October days, but it was less generous, warmth had faded and coats were making an appearance. Leaves were turning amber and the occasional pair of gloves could be seen. There wasn't much learning, but the class filled me with joy. We were all very still immature and we carried buckets of banter wherever we went. Most social barriers had broken down and for the most part everyone got on. One afternoon, when everyone had gone home, I found myself sitting alone on the steps outside the sports building waiting for my maths class. There was some wishful thinking, hoping Price would skip out of the building behind me, but it didn't happen. I just felt the ever-growing coldness and looked across the college ground towards the main building where the maths class was held. On the ground floor of that building was a computer room/library. In there, it was always much quieter than the one in the sports building, occupied by people doing A-levels and law, people who actually cared about their education and dreamed of that 9-to-5 job and a company car. I walked into the library/computer room and was hit by the silence. Many good-looking girls who appeared a social class higher than me typed away in little jumpers and perfect postures, looking at their screens with possessed eyes. There was no MySpace or Facebook here. Microsoft Word ruled supreme. I walked past the bookshelf and peered around for a free computer, and there she was, sitting alone in the far corner of the library, her chin resting on her hand as she looked at her computer screen with glazed eyes and a bored sigh. She looked very different from the other girls, in her vest top and tracksuit bottoms. She hadn't seen me, and I walked up quietly behind her and whispered in her ear, "Hey." She barely looked at me. There was a sadness in her eyes I didn't understand. I took a nearby chair and sat beside her and watched her play a game. She was tapping a spacebar, moving forward a poorly pixelated helicopter up and down, avoiding obstacles, trying to get as far as she could. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Suppose." "Where's your mates?" she said, keeping her eyes on the screen. "They've gone home. I have that maths class today, remember?" "Not really." "Oh, well, yeah. Anyway, you're my friend, aren't you?" She didn't say anything. She just kept tapping the spacebar. She didn't appear herself. That excitement I associated with her strongly was nowhere to be seen. There was a definite problem, but I wasn't going to ask. I just wanted to cheer her up. "That score's rubbish," I said, standing up, wheeling her chair away and leaving her facing a bookshelf. I then sat in front of the screen and could see a flash of pink in my peripheral. I began to tap away, closing in on her high score, then crashing the helicopter just before beating her score. "Ha!" she shouted loudly. It made everyone jump, including me. I looked at disgruntled brown eyes all around us, before Price kicked my chair out the way. My turn. We played for a while and spoke about nothing, but it meant everything. We laughed and ignored the obvious daggers from the girls around us. Our hands occasionally brushed as we took turns upon the spacebar. Her pink smile had become a permanent fixture and her green eyes began to listen. "I'm going on holiday this winter, skiing," she said, whilst navigating the helicopter. "Wow, I've never done that, but I'd love to." "You going with your family?" Yeah, me, my mum, sister, and my boyfriend. My dad's not going, my parents don't get on, she said as I thought about that corpse in the woods. I see. But there's a problem, said Price. What's that? I don't want my boyfriend to go, she said as the small helicopter crashed. She turned to look at me. The smile had gone, but the sadness had too. Something strange happened last night, but I don't know if I want you to hear about it, she said. I won't mind. Well, I was in bed with my boyfriend last night and he put the sheet over his head and covered his face. Apparently, it's because I kept talking about you. She paused and looked at the floor before looking at me again. He said I'm going to fall in love with you. From the day I had met Price, I knew something was there. I guess it's called chemistry. From that day, I felt like I was looking at my best friend. We just needed to get to know each other. We just needed time to speak. Each word would be a brick, building a one-way path to a destination we could already see. The only question was we prepared to walk there? I looked into the green eyes without a clue of what to say. I wasn't prepared for that. I remember her smile was bigger than beauty itself. I don't remember going to the maths class that day, but I do remember standing at the bus station later that day looking at Price. On the walk there, almost nothing had been said. There was something bigger now, and words felt useless. Before we departed, we stood opposite each other, in the silence that screamed a want. But naivety got the best of me, and I let the moment pass. Looking back now, I realised the problem. My body wanted hers, but my brain didn't know what to do. It's never been here before. But fortunately, Price took the moment. Can I have your number? I obliged. But what we both wanted was a kiss, something I only realised now 10 years later. I remember sitting on that bus and receiving her text as it pulled out the station. It said, I really, really, really like you. Several weeks passed, and now when people breathed, small white clouds appeared in the cooling air on them dark mornings to college. My phone became a permanent fixture in my hand. It was the escape from a world I was slowly removing myself from. I still witnessed the laughing and joking on the bus, but only my eyes observed. My headphones were in, and I listened to Led Zeppelin and My Chemical Romance, always waiting for the next text from Price. My world had become just the time I spent with her at college. All other time was just waiting time, constantly waiting for words in the form of a 10-pence text message. I was really turning numb to reality. Life was a girl, and my friends and family were now less heard than the music in my ears. My friends had noticed the change. I must have looked awful, sitting alone on that bus with my long black hair and my glazed eyes, listening to heavy rock. It was quite a fall from grace. Only a month previous I was laughing and joking, constantly trying to lift spirits. Now I resembled a ghostly one. Thinking back now, I'm sure a lot would have been said behind my back, jokes and piss-taking are for sure. But I can't blame them. I wasn't happy. A deep emotional freeze had taken hold of me. The problem was quite obvious though, I didn't realise it at the time. It was heartache. As Sylvia Plath once put it, I was in a bell jar. I felt trapped in my own little world. I could see my friends and my family, but no longer did I understand them. All I ever heard was my internal voice playing over and over and over again. On one of them cold mornings, our class had gotten into a white minibus. We were about to take a short ride across the town to the city's football grounds training pitch, where we were about to play hockey. As we waited for our teacher to come aboard and drive us, an orange was being thrown around in a very childish way. I, Shania, Price and Wolfie were on the back row. Occasionally, the orange would come our way, hitting us and we would laugh. We would then pick it up and throw it at our next target. It was all in good humour, until Price decided to push some boundaries. Sat up front was Jim Mackinson, also known as Mackie. We didn't know much about him then, just that he had done some modelling for a few magazines and that his girlfriend would meet him after every class. He was an intimidating guy, never spoke a word to anyone, and would enter each class late, slinging down his huge leather bag, then stare at the class with his piercing blue eyes, daring anyone to question him, including the teacher. Oh, and also, he was just about the biggest guy in the class. As usual, he was minding his own business, when, for reasons I will never understand, Price took the orange and threw it at him. Now, this is no tangerine which you may be imagining, listener. Oh no, it was a full-fledged orange, as big as your fist. It glided through the air and struck Mackie on his head, disrupting his peace and his perfect dark locks. Silence exploded. What happened next was what everyone imagined but thought could never happen. Mackie calmly picked up the orange, that lay beside his presumable size 13 boots, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stood up. Everyone's eyes was glued to the giant orange. I don't know how, but he knew exactly where it had come from. He leant over his headrest, pulled back his arm, and launched the orange straight into Price's face. It exploded hard. Sour juice dripped down her face. Sheer shock hit the bus. Nobody could believe it, as he turned around and calmly sat down. Now, an orange to the face sounds rather funny now, but nobody was laughing. The sheer force he had thrown it at was shocking. "Are you okay, Price?" I asked her. Bits of orange was everywhere, up her nose and in her hair. But she was brave and she showed me her pink teeth. But there was no mistaking her embarrassment. People's eyes drifted towards me. Price was my friend, and I felt a slight expectancy for me to say something, or even do something. What surprised me was a confirmation that people associated us. "Why'd you do that?" I said firmly across the bus. There was a tension as everyone waited. "I don't like things hitting my head," said Mackie, with the softer voice than I had imagined. "But that was ridiculous," I said, throwing a swear word in under my breath just to show how angry I was. But I was careful not to aim it at him. I was walking a tightrope. Stood at one end was a big guy who could pick me up and dump me in a bin. I think my balance was rather good that day. I seem to keep talking about buses. Well, we were on another. A bigger one, probably better described as a coach. All the students of the first year sports course were on it, and there was another one with the rest of us students behind us. We were heading to a place called Northfield Lodge. It was deep in the countryside, lost in the middle of nature and nowhere. We were to spend the night there and participate in abseiling, cave dwelling, and hiking in what would be called ice-breaking weekend. What I remember most, despite the cold and decrepitness, was the way the football academy went around. They were rude, loud, and obnoxious. All were in their identical tracksuits and their identical haircuts, marching around like a stupid Gestapo. You were the butt of their jokes, and if you did not oblige, you'd be on the receiving end of intimidation. But I already knew this before we got there, and I had made my plans. The only person they seemed to respect in our class was Jester. I mentioned him earlier briefly. You see, he was the rapper, and quite a good one. One of his songs was a hit with the Football Academy lads, and they could often be heard playing it in their identical phones. Up to that point, I and Jester had not seen eye to eye. To look at us, we were opposites, but behind our exterior, we were very similar, and that was the problem. We were big characters, and so far in our class, we had only clashed. We fought often for the limelight and the approval of our peers. Are you shocked by that? How do you imagine me so far? A calm, quiet type that would go on to write novels because he can't express his ego in person? Well, believe me, back then and still, I'm not shy. I was a nuisance for the teachers. The term, the class clown, comes to mind. So now armed with that information, you won't be surprised to hear what I decided to do next. I took stink bombs to Northfield Lodge to deal some sweet retribution. Now if you remember, I said the course was separated into several classes. The Football Academy class, the Netball Academy class, the Rugby Academy class, and our class, the bag of all sorts of misfits. Well, that's how the sleeping quarters worked too. The male members of my class shared a room. It was large and held 5 bunk beds. I will come to that soon. On the first evening, everyone sat in a cold hall on benches eating dry sandwiches and unwanted fruit. I sneaked out to the back room. There, I took out my stink bombs from my bag and quietly made my way to the Football Academy's room. I took the stink bombs in my hand, looked around at their bunk beds, then raised my fists high. I was imagining them all in bed in the middle of night, imagining I had poured petrol all over the carpet. As the fumes woke them from their dreamland, and they tamely opened their eyes, I was lighting a match. In the dark they all looked at me, the dancing flame beneath my pale skin, my smile illuminating the horror their banter brains could never grasp. As they began to realise this was no nightmare, it was far, far worse. I let the flame drop, and then... But no. In reality, I had just set off the stink bombs. I threw them hard to the floor. And you know what? They stunk. The smell was a mixture of rotten eggs and farts. It was disgusting, and I held my breath as I made my way back to our busy cold hall in which everyone sat. I went back to the bench with my classmates and tucked into a cheese sandwich. A few minutes later I heard, "Who the hell let off a stink bomb in our room?" shouted the biggest goon at the top of the hall. I kept my head down and smiled. More goons appeared with the same look, the same hair, and the same bloody tracksuit. It was supposed to be funny, but nobody was laughing. The teachers had to calm the goons down. Word spread that when they found the man who did it, he was dead. Maybe the smart thing to do would be to keep quiet, but I was not smart. I am an attention seeker. So, when I and the lads from my class retired to our room for the evening, it wasn't long before I broke my big story. We were all laid in our beds. I had a top bunk, and most of the evening I and Jester were trying to one-up each other, both trying to get the biggest laugh, and we were about tied. There was a little tension between us, but I had the winning hand. "I know who let off that stink bomb earlier," I said. "Who?" said Rick Collins on the bunk bed above Jester's. Everyone's eyes focused on me. "Well, me obviously," I said with my hands behind my head, looking up at the ceiling and trying to look very cool indeed. Imagine Tom Sawyer when he got all the other boys painting that fence. "Ha ha, nice one," said Wolfie on the bunk below me. I could see smirks all over the lads' faces, except one, Jester. Teenage testosterone threw around more banter. What I did next, I can't explain. I can only blame immaturity. As Jester stood near the door, I threw an unwanted apple at the back of his head. It had the desired effect. Everyone laughed. Jester rubbed the back of his head and left the room wincing. In truth, it was harsh. It hit him pretty hard, with a louder thud than I had expected. But he was soon back, with angry football goons. "Who hurt Jester?" shouted the biggest goon with big ears. I lay on my bed and gulped. Jester looked straight at me, rubbing his head and smiling a coy grin. "Come on, own up. Who did it?" he demanded. Nobody said a word. I was now thinking about the stink bombs. Jester had just had to say the word, and he could have me pulverised. I was sweating, probably turning red. Jester watched me squirm, and as proceedings reached the highest intensity, "Look, lads, I don't think he's here, and I think it was a little bit of an accident if I'm honest," said Jester. "Do you want us to find him?" said Top Goon. "Nah, it's okay, but thanks though," said Jester, as the troop marched back out. I was left with Jester smiling at me. I couldn't help but smile back, half in relief, half knowing I'd been outclassed. From that moment we were friends. There was a respect, and our class was about to find out our partnership could be brilliant at times, but brutal. The rocker and the rapper. The next day, classes broke into groups. Groups of about 10 made up of a mix of different academies and us mudbloods. I remember abseiling off an old bridge and exploring caves. I should have loved it, but I didn't, because I wasn't with Price. Later that evening, we returned back to Northfield Lodge. I remember having a quick wash back at the room, then being told to congregate on the wooden benches in the old cold hall at 7 p.m. Once again, we were fed sandwiches, fruit and biscuits. The food was terrible. We found ourselves automatically sitting with our classmates. I sat beside Wolfie, but I kept looking down the bench towards Price, and she kept looking at me as she spoke to Shania. Darkness had fallen upon the lodges, and the staff, aided by our teachers, told us to wrap up warm. We were heading out. They took us all to a nearby woods, leading the way, shining their torches, killing the dark. At the edge of the woods, we were shown a rope that led into the dark trees. It looked like an horizontal abyss, something I found strangely beautiful. Our objective was to hold onto the rope and make our way through the pitch-black woods back to the lodge on the other side. We stared into the darkness and took up the rope, ready to walk into the unknown. I remember a torch shining on us. A staff member brought a group of latecomers to join us. There was Price, and she was with Shania. But the moment she saw me, her green eyes were glued. She walked straight up to me and took my arm. "I'm going with you, Daniel, if that's okay, Shania," said Price, barely looking at her friend. I looked at Shania and saw a pain. Disappointment filled her face. I offered a friendly smile, but I don't think she cared. Jealousy just showed in her magnificent eyes. When we entered the woods, the torches were turned off. Price took my hand, and I listened to the nervous laughter coming from her. "You okay?" I asked, thinking about her fingers that interlocked with mine. "Fine, just a little scared of the dark, that's all," she said. We made our way through the darkness, constantly touching one another for reassurance and a little indulgence. It wasn't long before we were completely alone, except for the distant cries and lonely owls. I took a couple of steps forward and heard a cracking. I imagined I had stepped on a rotting corpse's thigh bone, but knew in reality it was only a fallen branch. Then I heard something unusual behind me. "Price, are you okay?" I asked into the darkness. Then I heard a crunch of more bone-like twigs. It was Price in a heap on the floor. "Are you okay?" I asked again, as I began to hear her hysterical laughter. She couldn't control it. It was laughter she couldn't keep up with. I'm sure if I could have seen her, I would have watched tears streaming down her perfect face. My hand wandered around until I found her laying on the ground. As I helped her up, her laughing subsided, and she managed to get out a few words. "I think I've peed myself," she said, holding my hands. I began to laugh, then did something so unlike myself. I put my arms around her, and in each other's brace we laughed more, then made our way down the rope. Fear was gone, laughter banished it to the corner of our minds. We got through the woods that night, and we were soon back in our rooms. Most took showers and cleaned themselves up, getting changed, spraying deodorants and aftershaves. That evening we were allowed into the games room. That had been kept quiet from us. There were 2 pool tables and a jukebox. They put on a spread too, more stale sandwiches, but with a welcome addition of bottles of pop. We helped ourselves, and spirits were high, probably because we knew we were going home in the next morning. I remember even the football academy lads seemed alright that night. They didn't dominate the pool table and the spotlight. They spent most of the evening trying to chat up the girls from the netball academy. That night, Shania spent a lot of time with Wolfie. I could see her eyes looking at him differently. It was he who she had paired up with when Price had ditched her. Her smile greeted him with every word, and she played with her hair. She had also removed her glasses and looked very pretty, like a pixie. I and Price sat together beside the pool table watching the games. I remember wanting to flirt with her, but not really knowing how. "Hey, you want a game?" said a blonde-haired guy from the rugby academy, pointing at me. I accepted the challenge eagerly. I knew I was a good player, and I showed it. I knocked the balls in one by one, nearly finishing a perfect game, but not quite. I remember Price's face lighting up as she watched me brush aside my competition. This was my way of flirting, showing off. My last shot was a difficult one, but it was a clear shot on the black. I took a chance. As I got down to play the shot, I lined it up, took my eyes off the ball, turned to Price, looked her in the eye and winked, taking the shot simultaneously. The black went into the heart of the pocket, and I listened to it roll into the table. I know it sounds cheesy, but it worked. I could see the excitement in her eyes. Later that evening, we returned to our rooms. I felt good. There was a warmness in my belly. I believe it's called camaraderie. I was surrounded by like-minded guys, and we were all laid in our beds, shooting the shit. The jokes were incredible. We took turns being the butt of each other's jokes, and I was in my element. It's where I have always been best, where I have always prospered most. I think my banter success comes from being ruthless but never cruel. I know where the line is, and I will chase the guys at the top of the verbal food chain, perhaps more ruthlessly than the ones at the bottom. Put me with a group of men, and with enough time I almost always attain a high level of admiration. But gaining the admiration of women has always been a bit of a mystery to me. I believe it's because women require much more attention solely devoted to her to make her like you, and I believe I've never really wanted or been able to do that, probably because I am just as selfish in soul. Take for example the average friendship circle of men and women. Men tend to have many friends, while women just have 1 or 2. I believe it's because men want to be surrounded by laughs and love, while women want to be loved. Sorry, where was I? Oh yes, in the bedroom, top bunk, shooting the shit. I laid there feeling very relaxed and could see my classmates saw me in a new light. I was no longer the weird emo guy. I was now Daniel, the funny guy. Then there was a knock on the door. 3 females appeared around the corner, a blonde, a brunette and a redhead. It was Kristen, the blonde with big you-know-whats that I mentioned earlier, Price, the brunette girl who you already know, and Shania, she's a redhead. They were more than welcome. They were our classmates and they joined the conversation, spectating more but pleased to be with us. Price stood nearby my bed and we spoke casually. I remember her eyes, they kept looking at my topless body. Even young, awful with women, virgin me, could see that she liked what she saw. At some point, a teacher intervened and the girls were ushered out. Then the lights went out and our heads hit the pillow. The jokes continued into the dark, and in the early hours of the morning, Tim Holland got teabagged. If you don't know what that is, Google it. It involves scrotums. It began to rain a lot, and black clouds seemed a permanent fixture in the sky. My eyes flicked between the patter of rain and the classroom window, and my only light, Price's face. I rarely sat beside her during class. I was beginning to sit next to Jester a lot. I still sat with Wolfie occasionally, but he found a new friend in Derek Patterson, a small guy who was a by-the-book grade A student. He still loved the classroom banter, but most was now left to me and Jester. On one of the rainy days, me, Wolfie, Jester and Rick found ourselves in a dark hallway in an old building at the back of our college after class had finished. We looked out at dark sky and rain that covered the city. Great, what can we do? We don't have another class till 4, said Rick, with a tormented expression that seemed constant a part of him. Well, we could go to that pool club, suggested Wolfie, with his ever-present optimism. Where's that? Probed Rick. I don't know, to be honest. Well, that's good, isn't it? Said Rick, with his face turning a shade darker. I know where it is. It's a 5-minute walk, said Jester. But it's chucking it down, said Rick. But it would burn a few hours, I said, looking at everyone from the doorway. So in agreement, the 4 of us ran through the college and the rain into the city. Jester led the way, jogging up to the neon lights glowing in the dark day that read "Pool" in red light. We gladly entered the refuge of the little corridor that led to a black door at the end. Have you guys been here before? Asked Jester, looking up at the big camera in the hallway. No, we each said. Beside the door, Jester pressed the intercom, but nothing happened for some time. So he took out his wallet and bank card. I was wondering what he was up to when he slipped the plastic between the double doors. He moved it to the lock and pushed the plastic between the metal and the wood, then released the catch. The door opened simply, and I was massively impressed. A little trick I've used to my advantage a few times in this life. We walked into a bewildered barman. Hey, how did you guys get in? It was just unlocked, said Jester as casual as ever. To my surprise, the barman even served us beer, as we decided to play pool on one of the larger American pool tables. I'm not sure if it was the golden liquid or the more casual environment, but the conversation seemed to flow better than usual. The sometimes cruel classroom banter was gone, and I felt I was getting to know Jester and Rick a little better. It turned out Jester's real name was Michael. He had moved up here from London with his mum when she had feared he was falling into the wrong kind of company, scared of the gangs and stuff. It turned out Rick was from a private all-boys school. I think that explained some of his peculiar ways. I assume me and Wolfie must have seemed very boring in comparison. Soon the conversation turned to girls. I wouldn't mind a piece of that Kristen, said Jester. Yeah, she's got to be the hottest in the class. Best of a bad bunch, said Wolfie. I could feel the gossip boy was testing me. What about you, Mercury? When are you going to grow some balls and make a move on that price? Said Jester. I was out of my comfort zone, so I got down and potted a paw into the pocket. She's got a boyfriend, I said. Forget that guy. She's yours. When was the last time you had it? Said Jester. I knew I had to let the cat out the bag. Strangely, I didn't feel too much shame. Maybe there's something special in this beer, I thought, as I walked over to my beer. I've never done it, I said, confidently, taking another swig on the golden stuff. What? Shouted Jester, deliberately missing the shot for comedic effect. You mean you've never put your thing in a thing? That sucks, said Jester, with a lot of hand signals, genuinely upset for me. Rick was laughing, and Wolfie had his gossip boy grin. Never have, I said. Well, we all got a first time. How old are you? 17, I said, lining up a ball and looking down the table. By the way, I'm taking 2 shots for that. Whatever. You're still losing. I could tell he wasn't talking about the pool. Nah, don't worry about it too much. You'll be in bed with Price in no time, I think, said Jester, with dirty-looking eyes that peered over his pint. I wonder what it would be like if I wrapped the pool cue round his head, making it break and asking him who was winning now, as blood redder than the tablecloth seeped under the table. I was having a hard time. That might sound oversimplified, actually. Another term would be lovesick. I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with Price. I usually stayed with her after classes until she got her train home, spending much of our time in college libraries or the cafe. One place we discovered was good for alone time was the sports building squash courts. There was a beautiful calmness in there when nobody was playing squash, which was almost always. It was cool, and a subtle light seeped through a small window behind us. We sat in the seated area that faced the 3 courts, facing the glass back walls of the court. I remember quite a difference in Price that particular day. Her smile had gone. The girl who constantly jumped on my back was nowhere to be seen. I was left looking into green eyes that gazed from afar. She did have the occasional days like this, looking like she hadn't slept the night before, but this afternoon she seemed more troubled than usual. I felt if I actually looked into them eyes, I might see an echo of a terrible event from the night before. I wanted to help, but I was just a stupid kid. It was then she gazed into the court as if she was watching a game, and she got up without looking at me. She sat on my lap and wrapped her arms around my neck, burrowed her nose into my collarbone and held me tightly. I put my arms around her and held her close. What's the matter? I asked. Nothing, she said, smiling, trying to hold in the tears. We sat there for some time, and she cried there, and I let her. Whatever she was needing, I was trying to provide. She then got off me and sat beside me again. A little joy had returned to her, and in her eyes I could see a little life. "Do you want to come to my house sometime?" said Price, smiling. Immediately, I thought about her boyfriend and what her family would think. Instead, I said, "Price, what's going on between us?" "What do you mean?" "Look, I love spending time with you, but," I said, looking down. "But isn't this a little strange? I mean, we text all the time, and I spend so much time with you, but..." "Daniel," she said, interrupting me, "I thought you were my friend." "I am, and that's part of my problem. What have I done wrong?" "Nothing, but can't you see this isn't normal? I've always gone better with guys. What are you saying?" I don't know. I'm just worried I'm looking like an idiot." "So I make you feel like an idiot?" No, I didn't say that. Look, you know I like you, Price. I just hope you aren't going to make a fool of me, that's all," I said as I watched tears return to her eyes. "I can't do anything right, can I? You just want one thing, don't you? And I thought you were different." "I don't want anything. I just don't want to look stupid, that's all." "What? You haven't got a clue, have you?" "What about?" "It doesn't matter," said Price. I watched her vacant eyes as she seemed to replay something horrible in her mind. "Price, what's actually the matter?" I asked gently, taking her hand. "Nothing," she said, turning to look at me. I watched a lone tear stroll down her face, and I caught it on my fingertip. I gave her a smile and wrapped my arms around her. She began to cry again, a real cry that made her body shudder. There was a deep pain in Price. I tried to be there for my friend. I held her tighter, wishing I could take away her pain. I sat on a train, on the seats with a table in between. Opposite me was Price's sister. I think there's only one way to say this. She was beautiful. A picture-perfect beauty, with blue eyes and long blonde bohemian hair, looking like a Californian Audrey Hepburn. Her nose was ever so slightly bigger than Price's, and her chin had a slight line in it at the end. Her cheekbones were higher than her sister's, and her eyes were bigger too. She was extremely slim, a delicate body, balanced between beautiful pronounced features of the face. She appeared somehow angelic, and a perfect science at the time. She was in her school uniform, which had the school's crest on her breast pocket. She was a second before ripe, like a forbidden fruit, and all the more tantalizing for it. "Are you sure your mother won't mind me coming?" I whispered to Price beside me, as her sister looked at me over the top of her phone, pretending to type on it. "She won't mind a friend coming over. Stop worrying, it's fine," said Price, reassuring me with a gorgeous smile so pure, one only a teenager can give. The train came to life, the engine coughed, and we were soon heading out of the city towards the town of Newark, a smaller, older place, like a sophisticated version of my hometown. I felt strange in the best of ways, like I was reaching for the second level of life. Price kept reassuring me. I assume I looked a little nervous. Her sister was trying her best not to act bothered about us, but her big blue eyes did not move from me one spot and revealed hungry ears listening to our every word. As time does when things are new, it sped away. The next thing I knew, we were in Newark Castle train station. Beyond the castle is the remains of an ancient castle rising up. We got off the train and plodded onto the platform, and Price led the way to the station's car park out the front. There were numerous cars, and I nervously wondered which one was Price's mother's. In the low evening sunlight, I couldn't see into the cars, just mysterious silhouettes, but Price led me to a big red estate car at the far end of the car park, and I got into the back seat. I looked up into the rearview mirror and saw two great eyes with wrinkles meeting mine. Then I heard a kind voice from a mouth I couldn't see. "You must be Daniel," she said. "That would be me. Thank you for letting me stay tonight. It's very kind of you," I said. Her eyes lingered a little longer. They judged me but did not criticise, sizing up the lad their daughter had become so interested in. She knew her daughter had a boyfriend, but I guess she understood her heart was now confused, and rather ignored this mystery. I suppose she thought to herself she'd have a look for herself. By the time we drove into her village, it was 6 in the evening and dark. We pulled up outside a very nice house, much nicer than my own. It was detached with a big red door. On either side was 2 large bay windows. It was made of red brick and a good-sized garden in front and back. If a house epitomised middle-class England, this was probably it. We exited the car, and as I approached the house, I heard clucking hens. It was coming from a chicken coop beside the house where 3 resided. I would later find out, much to my pleasure, they ate eggs from them every morning. We walked into the house. It was warm, and a lamplight lit up the foyer. The corridor was paved in a light wood. To my right was a dining room, and to the left was the living room. They were both basked in a luscious lamplight too. Ahead of me was the stairs and a passage to the kitchen. Price took my college bag and went upstairs and asked me to go into the living room. A large room greeted me. It stretched the entirety of the house to a French window at the back. I couldn't see through it because of the night, but the little light revealed wood decking and amber colour. Beyond it was a garden covered by the darkness. Near the French window was a long desk, and upon it was an extremely thin laptop computer, for the time that is, so I knew it was expensive. In front of me, against the walls at a 90-degree angle to each other, was white sofas that matched the white carpet. I sat there alone and waited patiently. After a few minutes, the door opened, and Price's younger sister walked in with surprisingly heavy feet for such a delicate-looking girl. She now wore jogging bottoms that boasted an expensive brand name and a jumper of the same preppy brand. I smiled politely and said hi, but she deliberately paid me no attention. I understood. She was one of them extremely pretty girls who do not need manners, because what they want always comes to them anyway. She laid on the adjacent sofa and waved the TV remote at the TV, clicking till she got her desired channel. Next, her mother came in, and for the first time I got a clear look at her. I could see her daughter in her, but only if I squinted my eyes and really tried. Her hair was short and looked dry and was lighter than Price's. Stress was evident in the crow's feet stamped around her eyes. "Can I get you anything, Daniel, to drink?" Water would be great," I said politely. "Just water? Are you sure you don't want anything else?" "Are them Cokes still in the fridge, Mum? We'll have 2 of them, please," said Price, walking in. She hadn't changed, but looked more beautiful than ever. Maybe it was seeing her in her own home, in her own domain. I was in awe. "2 Cokes it is," said her mother, walking out with a kind smile. I remember watching terrible TV. As I write these words now, the idea of spending an evening watching soap operas with 3 women as they casually comment on how good-looking the men are makes me shudder. But then it was one of the greatest things that had happened to me. Then the front door opened. "That's my dad," said Price, as I listened to the sound of a heavy briefcase hit the wooden floor. I heard a jacket coming off, and as I looked at the women in the room, there was no movement. Their eyes remained glued to the TV. In the hallway, there was the briefest of pauses and the slightest of sighs. Then I listened to his shoes echo down the corridor. Later that evening, me, Price and her sister took a walk into the village. Even in the dark it seemed beautiful. Large houses, distanced far apart, occupied each side of the road. We made our way down the long street towards a light at the end of the road. The light spilled from a large window. It was a fish and chip shop. We stood inside and waited for a man with a farmer's cap on and a Springer Spaniel by his side, and an old lady that looked like she had been to church. I wanted to order fish, but trying to be polite I chose the cheaper chips and curry, and asked for a can of dandelion and burdock. I remember Price and her sister arguing over peas. Price told her younger sister they didn't need another pot, that we had enough. I don't remember who won the argument. I just remember the way her sister kept looking at me after every sentence, like she wanted to know what I was thinking. Soon we were walking up to Price's house door, and I could hear interested chickens clucking away as the smell of food entered their beaks. I was asked to wait in the living room, and I did as I was told. Nobody was in there, and the TV was off, so I sat quietly in the lamplight. I could hear muffled voices coming from the kitchen, and the sound of clattering plates. Shortly after, Price entered the lounge. She had changed, and was now wearing the smallest sky-blue shorts that exposed nearly all of her legs, and a vest top of matching colour. I could see so much of her olive skin. She was carrying 2 white plates and hot chips on them. "Hungry?" she said, giving me a glimpse of pink. The braces, remember. We ate salty chips alone on the sofa. We didn't say much, but we spoke with our eyes. I don't know what it is about sharing food with someone in a quiet room, but there was an intimacy. It was the first time I'd really felt alone with her. Somehow, I could see her more now, truly, like her soul was naked, sitting there decently exposed, nibbling on a chip with ketchup. She seemed so pure. Then I heard shouts. "I don't care!" shouted her dad from the kitchen. A moment of juvenile serenity was let out the trapdoor. It gushed out below me, and I was left feeling tense. "Ignore them," said Price, as a silent storm of misery could be seen in her eyes. Then there was a smash. It sounded like a plate had been thrown. "Oh, God!" said Price angrily, rolling her green eyes and getting up. She left the living room and slamming the door behind her. I listened to muffled shouting. I had never experienced anything like it, and as I sat there alone on the sofa, feeling very useless, very childlike, I lost my appetite and waited for Price. She wasn't too long, and came back in looking her usual perfect self and closed the door. She then picked up the TV remote and sat beside me closer than before. I expected her to say something, but she didn't. She acted like nothing had happened at all, and I didn't want to bring it up. From then on, we were alone. Her sister had gone to bed, and I later listened to the heavier steps of her mother and father walk up the stairs too. We sat up for ages and watched television till the early hours of the morning. The later it got, the less we talked, and the more tired we became. Price eventually rested her head on my shoulder and took my hand. "I hope that thing between my parents didn't bother you," said Price, yawning and watching the TV. "No, not at all," I said. She turned her head and looked at me with longing eyes. "They fell out of love a long time ago." "That's a shame," I said, lost for words. "My dad gets drunk. A lot." "Daniel?" "Yeah, what's the matter?" "Have you ever had a girlfriend?" No, not really," I said, not able to think of a better way to put it. "So you've never kissed anybody?" "Yeah, I did once, last summer. I was very drunk at a house party. I can't really remember it, to be honest," I said, laughing weakly. "I can't believe that." "What, that I was drunk?" "No, that you've never had a girlfriend." "I guess it's just never happened. I've never really wanted one," I said. "Do you want one now?" Our lips had come close, and I could smell her skin and her faint perfume. I looked at her pink braces and felt an insatiable desire, but butterflies in my stomach held me back. We longed to kiss one another. I could see her lips were wet, but unfortunately I was a wimp. I offered a weak smile and she returned the favour, but hers was full of disappointment. She rested her head on me once again, but this time on my chest. She closed her eyes and fell into a gentle sleep. I was sat with the girl I had become besotted with. I watched late-night TV, far from home, but felt closer to anybody I'd ever been. I looked down at her perfect forehead and couldn't quite see her face. I felt her gentle stirs as I rested my hand upon her upper thigh. A weather report from the BBC came on about 5 a.m, and the rising sun was a matter of moments away. As I felt her body breathe, I realised a special moment could pass. I could have lost it forever, so I whispered in her ear, "Price." She stirred and stretched out her arms and eyelashes fluttered. "What time is it?" she said softly. While her eyes were still shut, I kissed her on the lips. She did not move. She was still for a moment. Then I felt a warm hand upon the back of my neck, and her mouth began to move. Our tongues touched and our teeth did too. I didn't know exactly what I was doing, but I persisted. I wrapped my lips around hers, hoping she was liking it. It was a bad kiss, but it was beautiful. As we pulled away, our eyes opened, and our smiles mirrored one another. Price's smile said, "Finally, you grew some balls." The sun was up, and I felt shattered. I hadn't slept, and as I looked in the mirror of her downstairs bathroom, I saw my long black hair become incredibly greasy. My eyes were bloodshot, and I had a headache, but it had all been so worth it. I heard Price's father leave the house that morning. It wasn't too long after me. Price and her mother and her sister were sitting at the kitchen table. I remember her sister in the black and white striped pyjamas top that revealed a lot of pale skin. She was skinnier than her sister, which was a hard thing to achieve. I noticed she had no breasts whatsoever, but any man would have agreed she was beautiful. We were all eating delicious poached eggs provided by the 3 hens outside. The conversation was light, and I wondered why their eggs tasted so much better than mine. I noticed the healthy dose of salt her mum gave them. You learn a lot when you're young. After breakfast and a quick wash, cupping water from the downstairs toilet sink and splashing it on my face, me, Price and her mother was driving back to my hometown Gatesborough. We set off about 8. I remember her mother's eyes kept looking at me, then looking away in the rear-view mirror. The drive took about an hour, and I felt bizarre, dreamy-like. It was a sunny day, and I watched the English fields pass by. The exhaustion and kissing of the girl I adored made me feel somehow reborn. I felt like a griffin as the sun warmed me through the car window. It was strange seeing Price against the backdrop of the streets I roamed as a child. It felt like my future and past had collided. Beautiful dreams and the cold reality blended and tasted so new I wasn't sure if I liked it. We soon pulled up outside my mother's house, and I said my goodbyes and said how very grateful I was to Miss Carter. She gave me a strange grin and said goodbye. I then took a good look at Price's green eyes and was blessed with her pink smile, and we agreed we'd meet at college on Monday. I opened the door to my house and felt very greasy, but with a cleansed soul. I walked into the living room, barely said hello to my sister, and laid on the sofa. There was an old black and white war film on, about men on a warship. I have no idea why I remember that, and I paid no attention to it all and fell asleep. My conscious self had been extremely happy with the proceedings. Then my mind did something. It reminded me of the problem I would rather ignore. I dreamt of his corpse just lying there, face first in the wet leaves, his body almost naked and disturbingly pale in the woods. There was something fascinating about the image, something exciting. It was forbidden, but it was beautiful too. The image, the dream, held so much promise if only it was true. I liked him being there. I wanted him there. I needed him there. "So, did you put it in?" said Jester, cueing the white ball and potting a stripe. We were in the pool bar, and Wolfie, Jester and Rick wanted to know more about my weekend. "How was your weekend at Price?" said Wolfie with a stupid grin. "Way," said Jester sarcastically as Rick laughed. "It wasn't like that," I said quietly, cueing the white and potting a dot. "So, you went all that way to her house and nothing happened?" said Jester in disbelief. "Well, we kissed." "Doesn't she have a boyfriend?" said Rick. "Apparently," I said, keeping my eye on the table. "Played Mercury," said Wolfie, with fluttering eyes, loving the gossip. "In class she seemed a little distant from you this morning," said Rick. "Sure you haven't ruined it?" "Probably because she wanted to get ruined," said Wolfie, with another stupid grin and eyelashes that looked ready to take off. "Hey," said Jester sarcastically again, as Rick laughed, turning a little red. "I thought Jester made the jokes," I said. "Wolfie's on a fine form today. You leave him alone," said Jester. "I don't think she's been distant, but things do seem different though. Not in a bad way. I guess we just know where we stand now." "And where do you stand, Mr. Mercury?" said Rick with a confused look. "A lot of that unknowing is now known. You know what I mean?" "Not a clue," said Jester. "So she's your girlfriend then?" said Wolfie. "No, just my mate." "All right. Just one of them mates you go round kissing." "Shut up, Wolfie." It had been a miserable morning, and rain continued to patter against the window of the pool club. It reflected my feelings. There was some serious melancholy, not helped by my friends' jokes about my tricky situation. I had felt that way for some time, distant from friends and family. Sitting here now writing my first cut, I understand the emotions that plagued me during those months. I should have been happy. I had a beautiful girl I lusted for falling for me, but there was only darkness falling around me. "What are you doing this afternoon, Mercury?" said Wolfie, bringing me back into the room. "I don't know," I said, peeling my eyes away from the grey clouds. "Spending it with Price, I assume." "Probably not, mate. She hasn't texted me all day. If the weather clears up, a few of the lads are heading down to Richmond Park for a kick around if you fancy it. Get the early bus back, could be good." I subconsciously looked at my phone. It was like somehow Price was listening, and if I said yes, somehow I was betraying her. It's strange thinking now how much I didn't want to play football with my old mates from school. I just wanted to be with Price, but she wasn't answering. "Sure, mate, we'll be good," I said, lying to my oldest friend. Later that day, after a docile kick around, I walked into my mother's house, but she wasn't there. I knew something was wrong because the house smelled of cigarettes. Nobody smoked there. It was then my stepdad came down the stairs and looked like he was shaking. "Daniel, I want you to know you're always welcome here. No matter what happens, this is your home, okay?" he said with glossy eyes. He then told me where I could find my mum, and that I should go to see her. He then went back upstairs like he had something important to do. Later I and my sister made our way to the house I had never seen before. Apparently it was a friend of my mother's. I remember seeing my mum sitting at the kitchen table in her dressing gown looking devastated. She found it hard to look us in the eye. Something had happened, but to this day I'm not exactly sure what. The point I'm making is, I really wasn't there. This memory should be clear, but it's vague and distant. My mother and stepdad had been together since I was 5 and provided me a loving, secure home. Their relationship was one of the foundations of my life, but then I didn't care. All I thought about was me and Price. I think 17 is a selfish age. I don't like to think that I was that self-centered. The people around me thought I was taking it badly because I seemed quiet, not myself. But the cruel truth is, I just didn't care. Anyway, they're back together now, happy as ever, spending a lot of free time with friends and going on holidays. I bet they like to remember that memory the same way I do. Barely happening. I entered the class that morning more numb than the day before. Price had not messaged me at all, even after my "everything okay" text. That morning, I tried not to look at her. I didn't want to seem bothered. She did the same, except I thought she actually wasn't bothered. I could tell something was different with her. She looked upset somehow, but only I could see it, for I had eyes that had fallen in love with her face, and I could spot the faintest of emotions, the slightest change in shade. A loving eye can see the flickering fault in its masterpiece. Her face didn't seem its natural self. There was no more tears. There was plenty of smiles, but it moved too often, like the opposite of an extremity of a mask, just resulting in the same conclusion, a hidden pain. The class ended. I learned nothing, Just more questions had been opened up by the voice in my head that never seemed to shut up about Price. It speaks too much still to this day, but not about Price. Writing is just a way of cooling the emotion of that inner voice that boils up. I walked out of class not listening to my friends or anything. I plodded down the stairs and out the building and walked towards town under the grey sky. I cannot remember where I was going. I'm sorry, reader, but that minor detail is lost on me. But I do remember what happened next. Somebody took hold of my hand. Intimate fingers interlocked with mine, and I felt warm with this stranger. I then looked across and saw Price. She didn't look at me, she was silent, and I glanced at the side of her face, and I could see it had changed. The inner pain had been washed away, the masterpiece was back. "I'm sorry," she said, sounding wonderfully out of key. "For what?" I asked, staring at her perfect profile. "For ignoring you. I just had to do something." "What?" "I broke up with my boyfriend." Me and Price walked hand in hand for some time. The only destination was words. They were bricks building a phonetic bridge, bounding us closer together. After walking wondrously, we found ourselves back near the college, and we stood at the entrance of the beautiful old square building with two great white pillars that occupied a huge wooden door. It provided us shelter from the rain that began to come down hard. Around the old building was a hilly grass lawn. We sat down on the dry concrete steps and watched the rain as the darkening sky that forced cars to put on their lights on the road 200 metres ahead. "Daniel," said Price, as a cloud of warm air seeped from her lips, "I think I love you." The rain began to pour harder, and almost nothing could be seen. We were in a prison of rain, locked off from the world. Then something happened that still shocks me to this day. Price stood up and took off her top, revealing her blue bra that hid away breasts that were barely there. "Come on," she said, taking my hand. We ran out into the rain that fell so hard it stung the top of our heads. We looked down at the drop below us. A steep grass slope led into a tiny valley. The rain hurt in the most pleasurable of ways, and Price encouraged me to take off my soaked t-shirt. I was topless, and Price smiled. Her pink teeth amounted to my everything. She took my hand, and together we ran down the steep hill into the rain, into love. At the bottom, we laughed, and skin on skin we embraced as tears from the sky soaked our teenage bodies. I kissed her in a way that only passion knows, instructed by a pure need. My hands moved with a human lineage of emotion, and at that moment I stopped feeling numb, and the world became real again. The season was getting colder as my heart was warming up. At college, Price would often hold my hand publicly and sit on my lap as we waited for class. Behind closed doors, there would sometimes be kisses. Officially, she wasn't my girlfriend, but in reality, that didn't matter. Our classmates would joke about our situation lightheartedly. They knew the deal, and we knew it too. I think the truth was, my youthful self had what he wanted, and the idea of changing anything was a risk I wasn't prepared to take. It was now colder on the walk to and from college. The bus was bitter and often marked with spots of snow. At college, all my free time was spent with Price. Occasionally Shania would hang around us, but I think the constant flirting between me and Price was becoming unbearable. As the cold came in, she had been given the cold shoulder. She began to spend time with Wolfie and Jester and Rick, and she immediately looked happier. Thinking about that friendship makes me smile. I'm sure it was mainly built on words that slagged me and Price off, making jokes about us. That might sound bitter, but honestly, it's not. I would have done the same thing if I was her. I can't blame Shania, because she had been pushed out by childish antics. I think Price was even outright rude to her at times. She looked out of place with the guys. She was small and timid looking. Anyways, back to my confession. The Christmas break from college was coming up. I most rejoiced at the thought, but not me. I shuddered. That was more time away from Price. I stood outside the sports building after our very last class of that first term. 11 AM on a Thursday, as you can imagine, hardly anyone turned up. It had been snowing, and in our winter jackets, I and Price hugged each other. As I embraced her, I looked over her shoulder and saw Wolfie at a safe distance with Ken Bridge, rolling his eyes, and another guy I didn't recognise. They were waiting for me. Then, in the light of the winter's day, she planted her warm lips on mine and kissed me. For a moment, the season disappeared. "Message me," she said, letting go and walking away briskly. I stood there dazed and not quite confused. "Come on, Mercury, it's freezing," screamed Ken Bridge as Wolfie let out a laugh into the cold, crisp air. We walked steadily into town, towards the bus station, being careful not to slip on the icy path, when the random guy from Ken's class said, "Is that your missus?" He was a big guy with red cheeks and looked kind of fat without being fat. I thought it was strange how he just wore a t-shirt even though it was literally freezing. Apparently his name was Taz, so Ken told me later. Don't even ask, said Wolfie for me. I was at home at my dad's house, in the bathroom. Through the blurred window, the only thing that was visible was the white snow on the rooftops. The light was off, and the dim winter daylight was all I had. My top was off, and I looked through a circular mirror above the sink, examining myself. My mind was different then. Most different was the insecurities, mostly physical. As I stood there, I saw a disgusting pale, weak teen. I looked at my hair and told myself it was disgustingly black. I've revelled in how thin it was. My mind accentuated the grease. I saw a weak chin and pulled my hair back to look at my big pointy ears. I smiled horribly and forced myself to see something awful, something horrible. I saw something disgusting in that reflection, something unworthy, inhuman, something nobody could ever love. I was a 17-year-old boy. The only thing that was weak and unworthy at that time was my mind. But it takes a maturity to understand that. We tell ourselves lies, we all do it. We see the problems in the mirror. I'm talking to you now directly. Guess what? It's only your problem, and you're making it worse. I will tell you a secret. Nobody actually gives a crap. People might say things, and you know why they say it? Because they are scared somebody might mention the insecurities they have. So, like the coward they are, they talk about your problems, so nobody talks about theirs. You look fine, and you're better than fine. If it makes you feel better to hear this, I have done things to some of them cowards, and they won't do it again. But back then, I was guilty too, and I did one of them predictable things most of our population spends most of its time doing. I wanted to look better, so I began to work out. It's funny, how the problem's in our mind, but we try to fix it physically. A new gym, a new car, a new t-shirt, a new dress, maybe new friends. If you want my advice, stop thinking about yourself so much. Buy a book. Lose yourself. Forget about your pathetic problems that don't actually exist. Sorry, where was I? Ah yes, a pale 17-year-old looking at themselves in the mirror and thinking how ugly he was. Boo-hoo, get the violin. So anyway, the year before this story began I nearly joined the military, but my mum talked me out of it, even though my dad bought me a weight bench. It was then, gathering dust in the garage, a few days before Christmas, I persuaded my dad to help me get it out and assemble it in my room. I say help, he assembled it, and our family pooch got in the way. So I began to lift, as they cool kids call it. I listened to the band My Chemical Romance, blaring them at 11, mainly to a song called This Is How I Disappear. I would take creatine before and after, then sit on my bed and message Price. I don't remember much else about that Christmas. I remember getting a Family Guy box set on DVD and not really watching it as I'd text Price eating Christmas chocolates. All the Christmas money had gone on phone credit. I told my dad about Price and nervously asked if she could come over one day. Back then I didn't like to ask him really anything. His jaw always seemed constantly tense then. He would normally grant me my wishes, but not without making me feel a bit bad first, regardless of how menial the request often was. He only did this to me. Any friends or strangers, he's overly generous. Anyway, he said Price could come over. Christmas Day came and went, and all I remember is casual clothing, cake and indoor lights. On evenings it snowed and white winter powder decorated the streets for more than a week. Text messages between me and Price had been constant, and one day, not long before we were due back at college, we arranged for her to come round to mine and stay. I was nervous but more excited. I hadn't seen her in almost 2 weeks. On the evening she was due, the night sky rose, and I walked into the cold in a thick blue winter coat. I walked on white floor that looked yellow under the street lamps. As I looked up, there was a ceiling of black with lonely stars. I'm sure them winters 10 years ago were colder. I can imagine now the wind penetrating my coat as if it wasn't there. The walk led me past my old school. At the end of the road, I came to a field that looks out towards woodland. Then I turned right, down the hill to Gatesborough train station. It's a small station, 2 platforms with often unsavoury characters hanging around it. A traveller community lives in caravans just behind the station, and I've heard stories of often young lads with dark eyes and quick voices coming onto the platforms, starting conversations and deliberately getting into arguments, or staring at men to just ask what they're staring at. When it's darkest, they've robbed people. If there's nothing to take, they just might give out a few punches and kicks. I didn't worry about the confrontation with them. What worried me was Price and her subsequent thoughts if it did happen. I assume most men feel the same way when they see a group of suspicious lads walking their way and a lover by their side. The scary part isn't actually getting the broken nose, it's the possible broken mindset. What might they think of you if you don't act bravely, if you can't protect them? As I approached the platform, I went up some stairs. Price's train was due in 5 minutes. I listened for voices coming from the platform, but there was none. So I stood alone in the freezing cold and looked down the tracks. In the distance, I saw a small light travelling across the horizon, gliding through the night. It kind of turned and was coming towards me and growing. The train came into sight, and I could hear it chugging away. Then it slowed and pulled into the station. The doors opened, and people slowly got off, and there she was. She stopped at the door for a moment and looked at me with a genuine smile. She hopped down onto the platform with a satchel bag and pink teeth. "You all right?" I said, feeling like Christmas had finally arrived. "Not bad," she said, as people left the platform and left us alone. The train door closed behind us and its engine roared. It was a little strange getting the train alone, but I actually quite liked it. She looked at me with her green eyes, their vibrancy aided by fading light from the train that was slowly moving out of the station. As it left us with the stars. They were scattered behind her head, and she looked at me a little confused. "You look different," she said. "How do you mean?" "I don't know. You just do," she said, smiling again. My insecure teenage mind heard, "I don't fancy you anymore." But as we walked out the station, she took my hand and my worries subsided. As I looked up, 3 lads with dark hair and talking quickly strutted across the road. As we crossed paths, they gave me a dirty look. I looked away. I didn't want to give them an excuse. They headed up to the station with no intention of getting a train. We walked. Not back up the hill home, but left into town. We walked past a couple of petrol stations adjacent to the river. For maybe the first time, I and Price was really alone. It felt exciting, and we wanted to make the most of it. Feeling almost like adults, we came up with a bright idea. We wanted to buy alcohol. But both being 17, that meant no bar. An option was trying to find a pub that might overlook our age for our sale in the tough economic times. But the possible ones I knew was far away, and their clientele was never the most welcoming. As we walked into the busier town on that freezing evening, a big supermarket shone brightly. Like a capitalist holy house, I looked at it for answers. "What do you think?" I said to Price. "About what?" "I could try and get served." "I don't know. I actually doubt it." "Worth a try though, surely. Who do you think looks older?" I said, as Price frowned, not looking hopeful at all. "We both look about 15. "No, we don't," I said, laughing. We definitely did. Price waited outside by a cash machine near the trolleys as I went to try my luck. I walked past bright aisles and made my way to the back of the supermarket. I looked at hundreds of bottles and realised I didn't have a clue what I was doing. Back then, alcohol was a mystery. Now it's my friend, whose company often pains me, but I wouldn't be without it. I wasn't sure if I liked any of them. There were the beers and the ciders, and after that I was lost. What I did know is I wanted to get drunk. I was just about self-confident enough guy to say she liked me. I wanted more though. I wanted my fantasies to become realities. I wanted my hands against her secret skin. I wanted my fingertips upon places unexplored. But I was 17 with an overactive imagination and an underconfident mind. I didn't have the resources to turn dreams into reality, but now I looked at the magic potions. They could turn my fortunes. The only question was, which one tasted best? I was looking at these brightly coloured bottles, red, blue and green. It said they were vodka shots, cherry, apple and blueberry. I picked up the apple feeling naughty, fearing I would drop it and spill the green liquid everywhere as the adults watched and shook their heads, pointing and shouting, "Shame!" See, that overactive imagination? With the bottle in hand, I walked as casual as possible to the checkout, but felt like I was walking everywhere, like somehow my hand had absorbed the liquid and I was already drunk. As I approached the end of the aisle, I looked at the numerous checkouts. Middle-aged women with dyed hair and too much makeup looked at me. They all looked like mothers, the natural nemesis of teenagers wanting to get drunk and have a good time. Why I picked the woman I did, I don't know. It was a lottery, and I was sure it wasn't going to work, but the potential prize was worth the almost certain embarrassment. I put the glowing green bottle on the conveyor belt. I watched the lady at the till and her eyes moved towards the bottle. She wore thick-rimmed glasses and had curly bright blonde dyed hair. Her makeup was a doll-like, red lipstick and purple eyeshadow and foundation that made her look orange. She was probably nearing 60, but was trying to hold on to that youth that didn't exist. She looked like a woman who sipped half a pint in one of Gatesborough's pubs at the weekend, cross-legged at the bar in her shortest skirt revealing veiny legs, waiting for a sweaty drunk who didn't know what he was looking at to give her the one last time. She looked up at me slowly. There was a moment, and I waited for her lips to ask for an ID I did not possess. Then there was a small smile as she took the bottle in her hand glittering in gold rings. Beep! She'd put the bottle to the barcode reader. $7.99, please. I didn't move. I stared in disbelief. She smiled again. $7.99, please, lovely. I fumbled for my wallet and handed over the money. With a wink, she put it in a plastic bag and told me to have a nice day. I walked past families with their weekly shopping, out the bright lights of the store into the darker light. Price stood alone with a hood up and looked at me with determination. I decided to play the fool, looking at the floor as if it hadn't worked, trying to conceal the shopping bag as best as I could. I can see it quite easily, silly. How the hell did you manage that? Said Price, nearly laughing, not aware of the security guard standing 10 yards behind her. Shh, I said, wanting to laugh, taking her by the arm and walking further into the night. We walked through the town centre, where it was a little lighter but darker, past pubs with their signs falling to pieces, past drunks with their lives falling to pieces, standing outside with a pint and a fag, cursing the smoking ban in the cold. They stared my way more than usual. The reason was Price. She was young enough to be their daughter, even granddaughter in some cases, but that didn't stop the male chromosome in its quest. It was a quick walk through the small town. Surprisingly, nobody said anything. They probably hadn't had enough ale. We crossed the road and headed towards the river. Many benches sat adjacent to a black fence that protected people from falling into the river. It was dark, and the light from the town 100 yards behind us allowed us to see. It was cold, and the river looked like flowing blackness, but I had Price alone. We took a seat on a bench, and she sat close to me, protecting herself from the cold. We looked at the murky water and the glimmer of the moonlight that danced on the ripples. It's true what they say about Gainsborough, then, said Price, holding my arm tightly. That it's beyond beautiful, I said, tongue-in-cheek, putting my hand high on her thigh. That it's a shithole, she said. We laughed, and I felt her body ease into mine. Yeah, but when I'm with you, nothing else matters, I said, it purposely sounding cheesy, almost sarcastic, but I meant every bit of it. Ah, so romantic, said Price, sounding sarcastic, but almost meaning it too. Anything for you. By the way, I have brought you one of the finest drinks around, I said, pulling out the green illuminating bottle from the cheap plastic bag. The drink almost glowed, looking toxic. Oh, my favourite, you shouldn't have, she said with a fake gasp and overdramatic hands on her cheek. I really shouldn't have. We both laughed as I screwed off the little black cap and handed her the bottle. Ladies first. I watched her pink teeth disappear in green liquid and then her green eyes disappear as she squinted and pulled her face. Strong? Sour, she said a little, coughing. And strong, she said, as I took the bottle and put it in my own lips. I enjoyed the taste, and the alcohol announced itself too. I like it. Shame we're drinking it here, though. Sorry, I said, handing her the bottle. Don't be, she said, taking a swig. At least we fit in, said Price. I don't want to fit in. I really don't like this town. Too many idiots around. There's idiots everywhere, Daniel. True, but it would be better to be drinking at yours, on your sofa. Well, there's an idiot at my house too. A massive idiot. I knew she meant her dad, but I didn't say it. I didn't know anything about him, and I didn't want to accidentally offend her, so I just let her speak. He's an alcoholic, she said, looking into the green bottle. We hate him. I realised something then. Inside her was a torment more than I knew, and I realised a truth in life. Price was basically middle class, pretty, and she lived in a big house in a country, and had a private education. But chaos tormented her soul. I was working class in a failing town that gave me an education in a school that struggled to get 10 students more than 5 GCSEs C and above. That school has now been knocked down. But my life had almost always been perfect, because I had friends and I had a wonderful family. I understood then, life isn't about where you are, it's about who you're with. Life is what you make it. And at that time, in my perfect world, I was lovesick, so I held Price closer. She then looked at me strangely, with an admiration, like she'd realised something too. Thank you, Daniel. You've been so good to me since I met you. It's okay, I said, kissing her on the cheek, feeling braver than usual. It was then she turned her head and kissed my lips and rested her hand on my crotch. She kissed me passionately, and I returned the emotions. Our hands wandered, and for a moment the cold vanished. Her lips moved across my cold cheek and stopped beside my ear. "I want you bad," she whispered. I looked into her green eyes and took the green bottle. I tipped it back and down some. There was a buzz in my belly, and it shouted at my heart. I ran my hands up her leg and then paused. "Don't stop," she said. I moved my hand between her legs until I could feel no further. I felt like I had reached the promised land, and nerves and passion intertwined in my stomach, creating lust. She wrapped her arms around my neck and kissed some more. My hands moved, not knowing what I was doing, exploring the physical essence of life and purpose. It was then she pulled me to the cold concrete ground, pulling me on top of her. She opened her legs and we matched perfectly. The only thing harder than the concrete was in my jeans, and I pressed it against her. It felt amazing. Price moaned. Her sexual needs, fueled by alcohol, had become way too much. We kissed more, but things slowed down because of the damned denim. I remember there in the cold night, looking down at her skin. It looked more pale than usual. I was reminded of that image of the cold corpse in the woods. I felt as though I was on top of it. I thought about it deeply for a moment. The idea did not repel me. Breathing on its face as I was aroused, I could do whatever I wanted. So sad we clung to each other, an emotion probably best described as want plagued and blessed us. We got up and cuddled on the bench, then walked home under the moonlight. I told her my dad said we must sleep in separate rooms. It was really my stepmom. She gave me a half-drunken smile and kissed me again. I looked in the little scrubby mirror above my bathroom sink, telling myself I was disgusting. My black hair had become a metaphor for my emotions. The roots close to me was my natural self, pushing out the darkness that had eclipsed me. My heart wanted to beat again, but I needed to rid myself of the heaviness of the last few numbing months. It was a weekend, a Sunday. I was back at college the next day to start a new term and a new year, so I decided it was perfect time. But it was a scary proposition. I was going to cut my hair short, not too short. I didn't want to show off my ugly pointy ears, but short. Thinking back now, it's hilarious how nervous I was, how momentous this decision seemed. As I write this, I shaved all my hair off 2 weeks ago with a beard trimmer. I took myself to the hairdressers around the corner from my house and asked for two things. Cut my hair short, but leave it a little still over the ears. I hated my ears then. Sure, they stick out a little bit, but to my 17-year-old's eyes, I looked like Dumbo after an ear enlargement surgery. The hairdresser asked if I was sure. I said yes, and she cut away. Immediately, I loved it. Suddenly, I looked normal. The paleness disappeared, the greasiness was washed away. I now looked like a normal functioning member of society again, even though I was beginning to have serious doubts about that. My dreams were getting strange, and thoughts I had been told was wrong all my life now seemed to make perfect sense in the right circumstances. Anyway, the next day, the usual crowd congregated around the bus. I saw whispers from girls I didn't know in the bus shelter looking at me. I assumed they were saying something like, "He doesn't look half bad now he's had a haircut." As for my friends, they were a bit more to the point. "Jesus, Mercury, you got bored looking like a freak then." Of course, there was a chorus of laughter. A few similar jokes of similar tone. I just smiled and wondered what a knife would look like forcing its way through their face. The bus pulled up and we climbed aboard and felt like the Christmas break had never really happened. The only difference was people telling stories about what they'd got for Christmas. They were exacerbated stories of bikes and gaming consoles and new phones galore, and I was suspicious. Everybody's parents seemed to have spent thousands on them, but they all lived in terraced streets and worked low-paid jobs. Or not at all. But I said nothing. I allowed their insecurities to get the best of them and watched their festival of lies. When it was my turn, I just told the truth. A few DVDs and some chocolates, and they didn't really know what to say. We slipped into class, and the old gang met up. Me, Wolfie, Jester and Rick sat on the back row of the classroom. I smiled at Price across the room, and she messaged me, saying my new haircut looked hot. A new teacher walked in, a young guy, early 20s, with elaborate spiky hair under designer glasses. "Hello everybody, I'm Peter Sutt. I'll be your lecturer for this class and this term," he said. His voice had a funny quality. It was rough and squeaky. I looked at Jester and he looked at me, and we couldn't help it. We laughed that kind of laugh that gets worse because you know you shouldn't be laughing. "Have you guys got a problem?" he said in his voice, legitimizing our laughter. We smiled and held the laughter deep down in the stomach, where it begins to hurt as it tries to escape. As the lecture continued, he kept staring at me. so I decided to join in. I was just going to stare back until he said something. He lasted about 5 minutes. "Have you got a problem?" he said, stopping his teaching. Everybody looked shocked as they looked at me. "What do you mean?" I said. "You keep staring at me. Why?" "Well, you're the teacher, and I just like your face," I said. "Well, I don't like yours," he said quickly as a flash. That got more laughs than I did, even a few oohs. I smiled. Game on. The class continued, and I turned to Jester and whispered in his ear, "Just start laughing a bit every time I whisper at you." So I kept whispering, nothing in his ear, and he laughed, and then I looked at Mr. Sutt. Jester was brilliant. He occasionally looked at him too. It began with a little laugh, and then it was a full-fledged belly laugh. I think black people are somehow better than white people. My eyes were cruel and full of accusation. "Get out of my class now!" shouted Mr. Sutt. "All right, mate, calm down," I said, laughing, as I squeezed past the chairs and headed for the door he was stood by. As I walked past, he said in a low voice, "Give your belt back to your sister," he said. "You want to do what to my sister?" I said loudly, captivating the class. "Get out now," he said. I walked out with a dirty grin. I stood in the hallway and wondered who won that tussle. I concluded me then, and thinking back I still think me. He should have known better. Though spring had not yet reached us, the winter afternoon had an autumn quality. A dying light on a grassy opening had a strange auburn quality. Our class had been playing rugby in high spirits, and something about the physicality of the sport brought a giddiness out of all of us. Especially when I gave Shania a real tackle, bringing the smallest girl in the class to the cold grass on the sunset. I tried not to hurt her, even though it would have been nice to. She laughed, along with everybody else, and as the lighting became vague, our teacher called the lesson to an end and we moved towards the changing rooms, then the buses to take us back to college. When we arrived back at college, I said goodbye to Wolfie as he got the next bus back to Gatesborough. I decided to take the one after, as it was closer to the time that Price was leaving for home. Our classmates wandered off, and winter's night sky appeared above us. We sat outside the college, happy to be alone, as light from the nearby building illuminated the opposite halves of our faces. She felt close to me now. The nerves of the last term had vanished, and we were comfortable. I was closer to someone than I had ever been before in my life. She smiled more now, real smiles that made her eyes wrinkle and revealed gums. We shared a packet of sweets called Pink Cows. They are strawberry flavoured and cow-shaped sweets, as you probably guessed. That hour in the cold felt closer than any home, because I was with her. As the clock counted down and the stars shone more brightly, I grimaced at my watch. Time was almost up. "Guess we best be going," said Price, looking at the clock on her phone. I grinned weakly and agreed. We got up and walked beside the facade of the college, when from another gate just further down, a friend appeared. "All right, Mercury, you get in the bus," said Cambridge, coming from his IT class. He was with that Taz, who gave me a small grin. "Heading there now, mate. You just finished class?" I asked for no reason at all. We all walked together through the dark winter's evening to the bus station. It was a strange group of people. I had known Cambridge for years, often invited round for barbecues in his back garden, where his dad would let me and him and Wolfie drink. His dad would get drunk with us sometimes and tell us stories till the sunset. I always respected Ken's dad for that. My parents wouldn't have entertained the idea, but I think Ken's dad knew better. It was better to have us drinking under his watch than on the streets. They were good times. As for Taz, I barely knew him at all. I had seen him hanging around Ken. They were classmates, and that's all I knew. He walked with his chest puffed out with his cheeks, and his long arms swung a little, more than they needed to. He was a big guy, and he seemed to know it. If Price wasn't there, I wouldn't have felt uncomfortable, but the combination of people just felt a little weird. "Mercury," said Taz, like he'd known me for years. "Does Ken reek on the college bus? Because he stinks in our class," said Taz. Not really, mate." "Really? You're lucky then," said Taz. "No, I don't," said Ken, laughing bemused and confused. "He also asked the most stupid questions," said Taz, putting up his hand and talking in a ridiculous voice that was meant to impersonate Ken, which didn't sound anything like him. Ken laughed and I saw Price smirking. We kept walking down for the duration. Taz mocked Ken in ways that didn't make sense. I noticed Price was amused by this. We were near the bus station when Taz pushed Ken hard into a steel bin. Ken bent over and looked winded as Taz began to howl with laughter. As Ken gasped in pain, Price began laughing too. Her eyes wrinkled and her pink teeth were revealed like I had never seen them before. When Ken got his breath, he tried to smile, holding his stomach. The whole scene was painful in many ways to me. "You all right, Ken?" I asked. "Not bad, mate," he said in a wheezy voice. "You'll be fine, won't you?" said Taz, slamming a big hand on Ken's back. When Ken eventually caught his breath, I went to kiss Price goodbye, but she didn't kiss me back. She just let our lips meet, and her eyes watched Taz. "Bye," I said, giving her my nicest smile. She smiled back, but hid her pink teeth behind sealed lips. I watched her walk away, and Taz joined her, walking to the train station. I listened to her fading laugh and watched her begin to skip, all the time looking up at the tall Taz. Winter was fading, and daylight was getting a little longer. My 18th birthday was a mere 2 weeks away. It was half-term, and I was at Price's house. We were in the spare bedroom playing Crash Bandicoot, and in between levels we kissed and ate sweets, red laces and cola bottles. We were constantly close, and I wore my comfiest jogging bottoms and she wore her shortest shorts. There was a wardrobe in front of us, and the door was a mirror. I kept catching glimpses of us side by side on the bed. We were young and healthy. Our skin was smooth, and most of it was on show. Both heads had a lot of hair too. We were both in vest tops, a perfect blend of youth and comfort, compassion and joy, dare I say, young love. The game was fun, but it was being with Price that was amazing. I remember the way she rested her head on my shoulder, and how she would take the controller from my hands and have a go. On one particular level, the theme was some generic, ignorant Middle Eastern theme. In the desert, men took swings at Crash Bandicoot with massive swords, and serpents took bites from baskets as men played the flute. I couldn't complete the level, and Price had been quiet for some time. Why she picked that moment I will never know. She caught my eyes in the mirror and said, "I want to sleep with you tonight." The truth was, I was never going to say it to her. I was the virgin, very much the willing passenger in the relationship. As unromantic as it sounds, I believe time and pressure is the simple and best explanation as why she picked that moment. I mean, of course there are many nice things to be said about Price and me, but why she said that then, I think it was simple science. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she saw something in the mirror I didn't. I know I think too much. Perhaps that removes me sometimes from the greatest moments in life. I overanalyze, but without that mind frame I wouldn't write, and you wouldn't be listening to this. I would be busy, being blissful. But instead, I think, and my thoughts spill onto the page, and sometimes now into savage reality. Anyway, I never completed that level. I laid in bed that night, in the spare room alone. A little light seeped in from the landing, and I stared at a yellow poster on the back of the door. It said Reading Festival 2001, and it listed all the bands that were billed to play that year, on 3 different dates. I was nervous, not worried, maybe apprehensive of the unknown. A little more time and then the door moved. Price came in her pyjamas, and got under the covers. "You okay?" she whispered. "Yeah," I said, beginning to sweat. "You still want to?" "Yeah. I'll be honest though, I'm a bit nervous. I don't know why." "That's normal," she said, beginning to kiss me. It felt different. Like a stage actor who in rehearsals had been absolutely fine, but now, on the big night, because of worries, he was going to mess it up, so he messes it up. My stomach turned with nerves, but below all signals were go. "Are you okay?" said Price, taking off her pyjama bottoms. She felt more naked than I knew possible. I slipped off my shorts and got on top. With my knees between her legs, I looked down into her eyes. I remember my back, and the amount of sweat was incredible. "I don't know why I'm so nervous," I said, as she kissed my forehead and smiled. "Don't worry," she said softly. "I won't talk about the physical moment. Let me just say losing one's virginity is often depicted as a beautiful moment. For some, it might be a moment of passion, no longer able to be contained, allowing themselves to let inhibitions go and act in a way more natural than they ever knew. But for me, it was terrifying. I know men aren't supposed to admit to that, but what kind of confession would this be if I started telling lies? After a couple of minutes of the most unsatisfying sex, Price smiled. I didn't finish. I never really started. After it was done, she kissed me goodnight and left the room, leaving me to think. As the sweat dried off my back, I suppose I felt relief. I had finally done it. "You do seem a little different," said Wolfie, as we stepped onto the college bus. It was still light, the evenings were stretching out in length, and the air had become less cold, less harsh, and if you listened carefully, you could almost hear spring whisper. "Really? How?" I said, taking a seat in the back row. The usual loud crowd wasn't on the bus, home. I was going home early because Price had not been to college. She had said she wasn't feeling too well. "Your jokes, they're more sexualised now," said Wolfie. "Really?" I said innocently, but thinking he was talking absolute rubbish. "Yeah, I think you're walking different too," said Wolfie, looking sly, orchestrating future gossip. "Whatever," I said with a smile, wondering what he would look like with no teeth. "Seriously," said Wolfie, laughing as I imagined him spitting out blood. "Nah, I guess maybe you just seem a little more confident." I thought about that for a moment. Maybe I was. I no longer felt like an outcast. The virginity label for a man does loom over you. It makes you feel insufficient, less adult, less of a man. As a virgin, when jokes are of a sexual nature, you're made to feel like a spectator, not a part of the banter. I suspect this is mainly a male thing, but in our ever more sexualised society, it might become the same for girls, which would be a tragedy. The bus rolled through the countryside as the sun shined for what felt like the first time that year. It shone on yellow fields as we passed sleepy cottages. "Are you going to Jester's house party?" I asked Wolfie. "I don't think so." "How come?" "Dunno, just not for me," said Wolfie, gazing out the window. I knew why. Wolfie and I had drifted apart slightly. Barriers had been put in the way. New people, mainly Price. Wolfie was more of a man of loyalty and comfortability. I had a need to socialise with new people. We were still just as good friends, and if tested, I'd have always sided with him. "Fair enough. I'm going," I said. A few days later, me, Jester, Price, Rick and Kristen stood outside Boston's train station. I never heard a good thing about the town, and my visions were soon realised. I was looking at grey clouds above a small grey town. Then I noticed it wasn't a cloud, but black smoke billowing from cooling towers in the distance. I looked left, down the road, and saw a dirty street littered with dirty people. They wore ugly thick leases and shuffled along miserably smoking. They personified the dismal town. Jester turned to us with a beaming smile. The contrast was shocking. "Welcome to Boston." Walking through made me feel rich. I didn't want to make eye contact with the obese women with their shopping bags and microwavable dinners, or the skinny men high on everything but life. We were soon on a cheap bus, half the size of the one I took to college. The bus driver let us on and couldn't be bothered to take our money. I'm no expert in economics, but I think it was that mindset that was crippling Boston. Nobody could be bothered to make it work. The bus managed to get us out of the town, and when we were in the countryside the sun began to shine again. Led by Jester, we got off the bus at a seemingly nowhere. I watched the bus choke away, back down the road. As it left my sight, I forgot about Boston, and everything seemed more beautiful. The sky had become blue, and whispering spring was now talking loudly through birdsong. I could feel the heat on the back of my neck as I looked at the woods in front of us. Then Price took my hand, and I smiled. "Follow me, guys," said Jester, leading us down a path into the woods. Our teenage group laughed and joked. Spirits were high. Normally we made jokes about each other, but since 90% of the class wasn't there, we made jokes about them instead. It brought us together. Soon, Jester's house appeared. It was a lot bigger than I had imagined, all white and quite old, at least 4 bedrooms, and had a big conservatory attached to it. It was awesome, really, surrounded completely by woodland. I would have loved to have lived there. The best part of the house wasn't there, his mother. She was away visiting family in London. It wasn't long before music was playing. Much of it was Jester's own songs. We drank beer and vodka and laughed like we had never laughed before. Other guests meandered into the house, and before we realised it, it was half full of drunken teenagers. I remember moving away from the moment in my mind, taking a moment to appreciate it. I was young and happy, and I had a beautiful girl I adored that laughed with me. As alcohol seeped into the blood, my feet wandered. I began to talk to many new faces. Everyone knew Jester. Many were from Boston, and there was a good mix of boys and girls. Somehow, I became caught in conversation with a girl on top of the stairs. She was about the same age and attractive. Not that I paid much attention to that. She had big brown eyes and rich hair. She had a healthy glow, and some may have said she was a little chubby, but I think they would have been confused by her big chest. We were in deep conversation, something about love and loyalty. Only in hindsight I can say she was attractive. My ignorant drunk self had honestly not noticed. I was engrossed in the conversation. She spoke about her ex, and I spoke about Price. If I remember right, she tried to offer advice, and I told her I liked Price very much, but we weren't actually together. It was innocent, but I remember glancing down the stairs and seeing Price walk by. She looked up at me in a way I had never seen before. It was pure jealousy, but I tried not to notice. The beer had me not thinking straight. Soon enough, my chat had ended, and I walked downstairs in search of Price. I walked into the living room, feeling dreamy and happy, when I saw Price sat on Rick's lap. Her arm was around his neck, and they looked at me. Rick's face turned red, and he didn't know where to look. Price looked shameful, yet somehow proud all at once. "What's going on?" I said casually. Rick jumped up quickly and looked truly startled and began to babble. "Nothing, mate. How are you? You okay?" he said. I looked at Price and she gave me a smile, one where only her lips moved. "Enjoy your conversation on the stairs," she said. "I'll leave you two to it," I said. I walked out the room and smiled at the people in the kitchen and grabbed another beer. I then walked out the house into the unkempt garden, surrounded by trees. Wild grass came up to my hip, and I looked up at a sky that was turning orange and pink as the sun thought about setting. It was a beautiful evening as I sipped cool beer. I felt more than alive. I was living. I wasn't sure what I had just witnessed, but I felt wonderful in that wild grass. I looked up at the sky, then closed my eyes and smiled. Then, from behind me, I heard the back door of the house open and close. When I opened my eyes, I saw Price walking towards me. In the fading light of the day, she looked stunning. "What's up, Mardy?" she said. "Nothing, honestly," I said, smiling and drinking more beer from my bottle. "It doesn't look like nothing. You're annoyed, aren't you? Because I was sat with Rick." "You're annoyed because I was sat with that girl." "Maybe I am," she said, smiling. "What were you talking about?" she said, putting her hands on her hips and looking deeper and more thoughtful than I had ever seen her before. "You," I said, beyond her into the sky. "Me? Yeah. What about?" "About how much I like you. But that we're not together." She looked down at the grass that danced in the gentlest of winds. "Sorry," I said. She stepped in close and I put my arms around her. "I'm sorry. There's no need to argue. You know I like you," she said. We looked into each other's eyes for what felt like the first time, and we began to kiss. I felt more in control than before, and I grabbed her with real meaning. We looked into each other's eyes, and this time we knew what the other was thinking. Hand in hand we walked back into the house. We walked through the bodies, and the beer, the music and the laughter, looking for somewhere quiet. We wandered past eyes and faces that felt like extras in our love film. We went upstairs, and I listened behind a door. It seemed quieter than the rest. We went into the room, and it was big, almost empty, but for a blue carpet and an unused wardrobe. Within a matter of moments, we was naked. Last time I had been plagued with worry and self-doubt. Now I wanted to really experience her. Drunk on love and with alcohol in my veins, I let go, and for the first time, I made love. The summer came, our class dispersed, and I spent most of my time with Price in them days. What I remember most about that summer is feeling free, the sunbathing and games in her back garden, basically having the house to ourselves as her parents worked. We would lounge about in the sun, in each other's arms, then move inside into the shade for a light lunch, eating delicious sandwiches and a few crisps. I remember half watching Wimbledon and a lot of her. I was captivated, and in my element. I had only just discovered. If you had asked me at the beginning what I wanted, I would have described that summer, holding hands on walks through the nearby woods in the village, then coming out into the light of the open field and looking out at colourful flowers in bloom. By day we relaxed in the countryside, looking at a horizon that stretched on forever, and on them warm summer nights, with only a single sheet covering us, we would make love. Sometimes I saw her dad. He actually spoke to me on a few occasions when he arrived home from work, while he was still sober. He seemed like a good man and asked me questions and appeared pleasant, but at night he would disappear into the corner of the house and consume what had consumed him. He had a beautiful family, but he had chosen to spend his evening with a bottle instead. Her mother was always nice. She'd become more interesting to me. I was always ridiculously polite, so polite it created a barrier rather than a bridge. I remember her sister during that summer. She would occasionally involve herself in our TV watching and sunbathing, sometimes enter our conversations, but she didn't get too involved. I remember looking out from the living room into the garden, and she would be in the sun in a bikini with big sunglasses. She looked amazing. If I and Price went out, I would see her eyes watching me through the dark lenses. She thought I couldn't see her staring with them blue eyes, but I could see them. They never left me. I remember one of those summer days, me and Price were in the kitchen, and the sister was in the living room at the computer with her headphones in. I was washing up our plates from lunch, dunking them into the soapy water. For a moment, Price put down her tea towel and stopped drying. She stood behind me and put her arms around me. Her arms moved south, and she began to touch a certain part of me, a place I enjoyed. "Hand me that washing up liquid," she said, undoing my zipper. "What are you doing? Your sister's in the next room." Half wanting her to stop, and half wanting her to continue, her hands got the better of me. I handed her the green bottle, and she squeezed the slippery liquid into her palms and took hold of me. I forgot about her sister and almost everything, and soon my DNA was in the sink. I looked at the water and decided I'd best change it. I remember standing in the Undale gym area where I had seen Price for the first time. Everyone was there again, but now a year older. I guess everyone looked older too. Faces had more meaning, more story. The major difference was the smiles and laughter in comparison to a year ago. We looked glad to be back, and even the occasional hug was given. Some people's skin was more bronze from the summer sun and a holiday abroad, but the major headline involved me, in my mind anyway. "No way, is it true?" said Jester, looking at me and Price. Everyone's eyes were on us. Shania, Kristen, Wolfie already knew, Rick, and the other characters of the class you don't know. They all looked at us with an eager smile. "Yeah, we're together, officially," I said with a feeling of immense pride. A sarcastic cheer went up. "Finally," was the word on everyone's lips. That morning passed and people shared summertime stories, and before long we were back in the classroom waiting to be informed about the coming year. Our form tutor arrived, looking much rejuvenated. He smiled and politely asked how people had been, and then he moved on to business, and it crushed me. "Okay, first of all, there's been some changes. So Iram," that was Jester, "Rick, Daniel, you'll be joining the academy class. Sometimes, when you get bad news, there's the delay. You don't fully understand it until you take a walk and think of the consequences. But not that time, no. His words were a phonetic hammer crushing my conception of a future, crushing something so precious, my time with Price. Our perceptions of life are always wrong. When we are asked about our lives, we usually think of our job, where we are, our favourite pastime. But in truth, that all means nothing. Life is relationships we forge. Life is people, and we need a little art for when the people we love annoy us. So this moving class news meant that all them relationships, them bridges I had built, were severed. It meant my life had been left to bleed out. I knew immediately I would have a lot less time with Price, which meant a lot less happiness. Looking back at me, Rick and Jester, we headed towards our new class, I should have been looking at the silver lining. I still had 2 good friends with me, but all I could think about was Price. With every step, sadness rose up in my body. The reason we had been removed from our classmates was obvious, though they never admitted it. It was because we were the most disruptive. They intended to create a better atmosphere for more conducive learning. I walked into the new classroom with a lump in my throat. I looked at the faces I kind of knew, but I didn't want to. I remember 3 of the football academy lads sitting at the back, in their identical blue tracksuits and their identical $9.99 haircuts with swept fringes and spiked hair. "Jesus Christ," said one, looking at us in disgust. Their audience laughed, and that set the tone. We were the rejects. In our class, we had been the one making the laughs, but not anymore. They dominated the limelight. The ridicule over us wasn't always vindictive, it was sometimes controlling, and they used censorship. For example, if I was to make a witty remark or a joke, a goon would promptly step in with a "shut the fuck up, you dickhead." And that's all it would take to have his loyal audience laughing. Soon, me, Jester and Rick shut up shop. We were done in the entertaining business. It was a terrible fate for me and Jester, creatives, showmen, who had just become caged birds. I don't remember too many cruel vindictive remarks coming in my way, except one. I sat at the back of the class one afternoon, and for some reason, I took off my shoe and sock. Probably a splinter or something. That's when the worst and the shortest of the 3 goons looked my way and saw my indecent exposure. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted with an absolute disgust. Where he attained his authority to speak to me like that, I don't know. "Look at it, it's a hobbit's foot. Put it away, it's disgusting," he continued as the class laughed. I remember turning my pen around in my hand and imagining stabbing it into his eye, then listening to his screams like a child as blood poured down from his cheeks. As the class looked at me and dared to feel anger, I would slam my foot into his head, and as he laid on the floor struggling, I would begin to strangle him, all the time smiling. How funny he would have looked with the blue ballpoint pen sticking out of his face. But no, I just said shut up. Quite pathetic of me, really. But mostly in that class, it was just hours of relentless boredom, listening to their stupid voices make stupid jokes. They weren't jokes, really, just putting people down and making themselves feel good. Jester had a nasty encounter with one of the goons. One day, during a break for both classes, the old one and the new one, me, Wolfie, Jester, Price, Shania, and a guy called Ricardo, who was a Gatesborough friend, went to a Chinese restaurant. The problem was Ricardo was friends with the lead goon, and the goon came to eat with us. It ruined the meal. He would make little remarks, mocking people for anything they said. His only contribution was the death of conversation. So we ate almost in silence, how the goon liked it. At that time, Jester was dating a girl from college who was doing her A-levels. The girl had relations with the top goon in the previous year. As we waited for the bill, he said, "Jester, you're dating Hannah, aren't you?" "I am," said Jester. "How do I taste?" said the goon. He didn't even laugh. He just smiled at his plate as he cleared up the last bits of rice. I hated that silence. I wanted to take that fork and reach into his eyes. Again, I could see how he enjoyed it. Jesse did a little. We paid for the bill and left feeling like we never wanted to eat Chinese food again. The air was turning cooler and the sunset was becoming even earlier. As the year aged, there was a particular weekend I remember at Price's. At some point that evening, I was upstairs sitting on the bed in the spare room. The door was open and I could see into her sister's bedroom. The door was wide open too. Clothes were all over the floor. She then walked into a plain view and looked at me straight in the eye from her room. We held eye contact and she smiled at me and I smiled back. She then turned around so her back was to me and she slipped off her t-shirt. I should have been shocked, but I wasn't. I just stared at her slim light-skinned back. The only thing whiter was the bra strap between her shoulder blades. She looked back over her shoulder and her blue eyes seemed vibrant as they looked deeper into mine and her smile grew. She then reached up and undid her bra, allowing it to fall down her arms and to join the rest of the clothes on the floor. She then turned around to face me. Her breasts were surprising. They were a good size bigger than her sister's. She put her forearm between them and put her fingers to her lips to say, "Shh, it's our secret," as her lips curled upwards and revealed the cheekiest smile I had ever seen. She then walked up to her bedroom door whilst licking her fingertip. Her stance relaxed a little, pushing her hip outwards, and she bit her lip. She then ran her wet fingertip down her left nipple and winked. Then slowly she shut the door. I could literally think of nothing. My mind was simply in awe of what I had just seen. Later in the evening, me and Price was watching TV. Her mother and sister had gone to bed. I noticed the conversation no longer burnt with desire, and Price was more interested in her phone than she was me. I didn't worry. By then we knew so much about each other. Before, so much of our excitement had been about the idea of getting to know one another. Now we were supposed to be content, right? "I'm off to bed," said Price, getting up off the sofa, not even looking at me. "Keep watching telly," she said, as if she was telling me. Okay," I said, feeling confused. I didn't want to chase her to bed. I didn't want to look silly, so I felt silly instead. I sat there alone, downstairs, for maybe half an hour. Then I turned off the TV and took tentative steps upstairs, but I could hear a little noise coming from the kitchen. Her dad was still up. I tried to be quiet on the landing and pushed open the bedroom door. I could see Price in bed, her phone light illuminating her face in the dark as she smiled at the screen. "Priscilla?" I said. But she didn't look. She bit her fingernail and just kept smiling at the screen. "What? Is everything okay?" "Yeah," she said, still typing away. "Am I okay to come in?" "Do whatever you want," she said, turning away to face the wall. I walked in and shut the door behind me, and the room went completely dark. I took off my clothes and got into bed. I could just see the phone screen in the corner of my eye, but I didn't want to see the name, so I turned the other way and shut my eyes and pretended to be asleep. I laid there for about an hour. Price had stopped typing, but I knew she was still awake. I think she knew I was awake too. The silence was too loud. It was interrupted by a crashing noise downstairs and the sound of something shattering. I got up and headed towards the bedroom door, and then for the first time that week I heard emotion in her voice. "Daniel, don't," she said. Her green eyes were just visible in the dark. "It's my dad. He's just drunk," she said, sounding frightened. "But I should check if he's okay." "No, please don't. Please come back to bed," she said, sitting on her knees looking fragile. My hands wandered to the floor, looking for my tracksuit bottoms, and I put them back on. Defying her, I opened the door and let the hallway light in. I didn't go charging down. I sneaked down on my tiptoes. I could hear his grumbles downstairs. From the corridor, I peered into the kitchen. There he was, sat at the dining table, facing away from me. He was still in his work clothes, shirt and tie, and he held a tea towel around his ear that bled. On the floor was a shattered whiskey bottle, its amber contents seeped under the table in the oven, but I imagined it was thick blood. I wanted to taste it. I wanted to crawl through it and feel myself in it. I wanted to know if I was still warm. But then, I remembered, it was only just the whiskey. His body language looked exhausted. His legs were stretched out, and his head was right back as he seemed to stare at the ceiling. I then watched him reach for the bottle of red wine on the table. He poured it into the whiskey glass, then into his mouth, all the time holding the blood-soaked kitchen towel to his ear. I hadn't a clue what the right thing to do was, so I walked back up the stairs and re-entered the dark room. "Your dad looks hurt." "Don't worry, it'll be all cleaned up in the morning." "No, I mean, he's hurt, quite bad," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed. I then got under the quilt and as my head hit the pillow, she put her arms around me and nestled her nose into my neck. My chest was her pillow, and I could feel the dampness of her eyelashes. She'd been crying. Then she said, "I hope he kills himself one day." Rick Collins had had a rough year. A once shy private school boy had begun to deal with a lot of dodgy people. He'd been drinking a lot and going to nightclubs in the city many nights of every week. I think there was a lot of pent-up energy inside him, and it was coming out a little too quickly. He had met some unsavoury characters on the dirty dance floor. I heard he was on steroids, not that it showed. I don't think he realised he still had to go to the gym. That wasn't so bad, but I also heard he was selling little white pills a pound a time, mostly to the people in the clubs, and even sometimes to the homeless. Through this extracurricular activity, his social group had increased. At the college, there was student accommodation. It housed many interesting characters, people often with no family or home. These youths with less emotional ties were susceptible to life's dirtier pleasures. For this reason, Rick had made the acquaintance of a girl by the name of Robin Archer. Robin was very pretty, slim, popular, and she liked to drink. All her friends were of similar description. One night, me, Rick and Jester found ourselves at Robin's place, her student accommodation. She had friends around, and all were female, apart from a guy called Ian Long. Vodka was consumed in copious amounts. The music was turned up, and the 5 girls enjoyed themselves immensely, as we did. The girls were all from Boston. The plan was Rick and Ian was to drive them all back that night because some had work the next day. But a problem arose. Rick became incredibly drunk and could barely walk. Outside the accommodation by his car, the girls kicked and screamed, demanding Rick was to drive them home. But it wasn't happening. He sat in his driver's seat with the door open and his head between his legs, facing outside the car. He'd been sick a few times, and it was piling up beside his new trainers. And Ian refused to take all 5 girls in his car. The tantrums were terrible. For maybe an hour in the cold, the girls took turns to cry and threaten Rick, quite savagely. But eventually, after diplomatic shouting from pretty girls who wasn't used to being told no, Ian broke. Begrudgingly, he allowed the girls to climb into his car like it was some clown car. As they did, they cursed Rick some more. They drove off, and that should have been that. But the lengths me, Rick and Jester went for a good joke almost knew no bounds. So it was drunken me, Jester and Rick sat in his car deflated when someone said, "Wouldn't it be funny if we drove past them on their way back?" The idea brought big smiles from our stupid faces. The ridiculousness of it was just too much. I don't remember whose idea it was, it well could have been mine, but I remember saying, "Rick, look at me." "Are you sure you can drive?" I said, staring into his eyes that I found difficult to focus on. "Yeah, why not, mate?" That was good enough for me. I jumped in the back, into the middle seat, and soon the engine was roaring. I remember narrow dark country roads as the speedometer hit 100 miles per hour. "Rick, seriously, slow down, we're going to crash," I said. "Relax, you wimp," said Jester and Rick, taking turns to ridicule me and laughing together. I was now more worried for my life than to catch up with anybody. My hands clung tightly to the headrest in front of me as I nervously watched out for the corners. 20 minutes passed with no sign of Ian's car, and the excitement was beginning to ease off. We couldn't find them, and I noticed Rick's head lower. "Rick!" I cried as a wall appeared in front of us from nowhere. Rick came back to life and turned sharply. He hit the brakes and lost control of the car and missed the wall by an inch. The tyres screeched, and we swerved down a dark country road we hadn't intended to come down. Rick stopped the car, and we took our moment for ourselves, to collect ourselves. "Right, that's it. We aren't chasing them now. That was ridiculous. We could have died," I demanded from the back as our hearts slowly returned back to normal. They both were in agreement with me now. "Okay, mate," said Rick, putting his foot back on the accelerator. He drove forward for not even 10 seconds. I don't know if he saw that corner, I don't know if he was awake, but he just drove. We crashed into a ditch. I was thrown hard against the side window as the car was almost completely on its side. There was a huge external panic. Just a relief nobody was seriously hurt. Without a word being spoke, we struggled out of the car. As I got out, I picked up the bumper that had come off and threw it into the field beside us. "You idiot!" I shouted. "Daniel," said Rick, looking dazed and quite obviously still drunk. "What?" "You know earlier when I was mocking you for saying we were going to crash? Well, now I think you're pretty cool." I remember about an hour later, some hillbilly kind of guy came to get Rick's car, and Rick's mother picked us up after. I don't think a word was spoken the whole journey back. She was fuming. I remember one night in them darker times, when the sun set early, I found myself on a night out with Rick and Jester. We were in a new club which leads you down into a basement. The theme was Hawaiian, and the main dance floor lit up different colours quite brilliantly. I was drunk, on a sweet overpriced cocktail, dancing to awful pop songs I wouldn't listen to alone. I felt good, but that was only the start. At some point, this terrible trio found itself in the toilets. Some guy stood near a sink selling aftershaves and lollipops. Beside him was a single cubicle, and Rick and Jester walked into it together. I wondered what they were doing, but I didn't quite question it as I stood at the urinal. Then Jester came out, and he looked weird, like his face had turned numb and his eyes were possessed. He walked past me and headed back to the club. Standing in the cubicle doorway was Rick, with his infamous perfect white shirt waving me over. I walked to the cubicle, and the guy by the sink looked me up and down, then winked at Rick. "Cheers, mate," said Rick, then shutting the cubicle door behind me. From his pocket he pulled out a clear little bag, and I could see a little white pill inside. "You want one?" He placed the bag in my hand, and I examined it more closely. I could see a little star imprinted on the pill. "What if I have a reaction?" "You won't, you'll be fine." "I don't know about this, man. I really don't want to say anything bad to happen." "Right, you ever smoked?" "I tried a joint once, just a couple of drags though." "Well, did it burn the back of your throat? If it did it make you want to cough?" "Yeah, why?" "That means you'll be fine. That means your body has what it needs to deal with the drug properly. It's something to do with the brain." Somehow, my drunk curiosity accepted Rick's pseudoscience, as if I had just listened to a professor at Oxford. With a slight nervous humming in my stomach, I took the pill with a swig of Rick's beer. He opened the door with a massive smile and said, "Thank me later." The glowing dance floor with my friends felt like something new, as though I had reached the next level in life. Joy rushed up and down my arms and legs, and I couldn't stop moving. The music felt touchable, physical. I could actually dance with it. You know that moment you see something hilarious that makes you almost want to cry with laughter, and you instantly look at your closest friends and share that precious moment? It was that, suspended, and you could do what you want with it. We danced the night away. Boy, girl, everyone was the same. I just wanted to share the joy. I felt like my own universe, but unfortunately, time still moved in it, and we had to leave the club. But we were still feeling the love. I think Rick and Jester had maybe taken another hit or two, and we found ourselves walking up to the college campus. Rick had messaged Robin Archer, and she happened to have a couple of friends over, so there we went. The incident with the car had been forgotten. As I found out in life, people are willing to forget almost anything when you literally have happiness in your pocket. We wandered up to the college and found ourselves in Robin's small college accommodation. In a room, sat on her bed, was two girls called Kat and Connie. It looked like they had been out too. They wore dresses and was dolled up. Kat had dark brown hair and big boobs that were fake. Connie was very skinny, pale and blonde, and had large blue eyes and was quite tall for a girl. They were drinking wine when we walked into the room, and Rick got a big hug. Kat and Robin walked out the room with Jester and Rick to get what they craved so badly. That left me alone with the blonde slim Connie. The room was dull. The only light came from the TV that was on mute and gave the room a bluish tint. Connie sat on the bed. Her legs were tucked up into her body and she smiled. Normally I would have been lost for words and felt quite awkward, but I remember talking and feeling amazing. I had never been so open in my life, and she was laughing and listening deeply. I couldn't begin to write what we spoke about, but we went on for about 2 hours, and it was one of the best conversations I'd ever had in my life. At times the others joined us, and then they left again. She kept telling me how funny I was. I could see she genuinely liked me, but attracted to me, I wouldn't go that far, until we found ourselves sat side by side on the bed, and as the sun seemed to rise from nowhere, she leant in and tried to kiss me. I felt her lips touch mine, then I looked downwards so slightly. "I'm sorry, but I have a girlfriend." "Oh, sorry, I didn't know. I wasn't expecting that," I said, smiling, turning to look into her big blue eyes. I then noticed that hopelessness in her. Maybe she saw something in me, rather innocent, maybe a little light that she decided she wanted to see if it felt as warm as it appeared. "She's very lucky, whoever she is," said Connie, as all her hope seemed to disappear, and she turned to the fake light of the television. A little later, I began to feel rough. When I looked in the mirror, my pupils were so dilated, I looked like a crazed animal. I remember leaving that morning and being on the train back to Gatesborough. I remember sitting down and looking at a guy smiling at me. I'm sure he was ridiculing me, way further down the train. I was sure he was laughing at me, but thinking back now, it was probably paranoia from the drug. When I got home, I tried to avoid everyone, and I sneaked up to my bed. I had perhaps the longest sleep of my life, and woke up the next morning feeling like I'd been away for a week. I remember the college term ending for the Christmas break, but I remember little about it. I didn't see Price that Christmas. She kept saying she was busy with family, and when she wasn't, she was busy working in a local pub in its kitchen. We messaged quite consistently still. She enjoyed the attention I bestowed upon her, but I think it had become less important. She seemed to care less about where it came from. When we returned to college in the new year, I met up with her. We sat in front of the sports building for less than 5 minutes. She kept looking elsewhere. Her mind wasn't with me. She was eager to get to class to catch up with the gossip I was no longer part of. She kissed me on the lips and skipped away. I sat there and felt alone. I had my own class to get to, a room of people I barely liked. I remember sitting in that class. The room was barely warmer than outside. They all talked and rejoiced to see each other. I saw a lot of fakeries, and I decided it would be better to say nothing at all. Soon our form teacher entered, and he smiled and joked with his class and asked them how their Christmas was. I remember he mentioned some achievements of some girl over Christmas break, and he asked for an applause. The class clapped, but I stared out the window and didn't. I guess it was kind of a protest against a class I had no connection or liking for. Then I saw the teacher's twisted face on me, and the applause subsided. "You know, I noticed something then," he said, as his pupils looked at him like loyal disciples. "Everyone in the class clapped, except for you, Daniel. You didn't. You don't care. That sums you up perfectly." He looked at me with utter disgust, and as I looked around the class, they all followed suit. Everyone looked at me as if I was an infection. I decided then to embrace it. "What's your point?" I said. "My point is that someone really excels at something, and there you are just sat there with no regard for someone who tries that little harder. You're going to go nowhere in life, I think," he said. I leant forward slightly in my chair. "Look, are you going to get on with this class or what? Do what you're paid to do or piss off," I said. Wow, the silence was astonishing, and the teacher literally was left with his mouth open. "What?" he said, raising a bemused eyebrow. "You heard me. Get on with it," I said, raising my voice. I could feel the tension grow, and even saw a little fear in some of the girls of the class. "Right, get out," said the man in his mid-40s. "You're pathetic," I said, taking my bag and glaring at him all the way out the door. I remember a couple of days later, a class finished, and normally I would have gone with Jester and Rick into town, but I wanted to see Price. I hadn't really seen her in 2 weeks, and she wasn't messaging me back. But I knew she wasn't in class from looking at the timetable in the corridor. I searched the sports building, the computer room, and the gymnasium, but she wasn't in either. So I took a walk to the main college building. I walked into the library and eventually went to the top floor. She was there in the corner on a computer. Opposite her was another computer, and that Taz, the guy from Cambridge's class. Price was facing the door I had entered, and when she saw me, the smile she'd been giving Taz disappeared. She looked like a child who'd been caught reaching into the biscuit tin just before dinner. "Hey, you alright?" I said, walking over, only able to smile because I hadn't seen her in so long. "Yeah," she said, looking shy. I walked to her and kissed her on the cheek, then pulled up a chair and found myself facing Taz. "You alright, mate?" I said, as normal as possible. "Yeah, mate," he said, grinning. "Well, I gotta go, Price. I will catch you later," he said, winking at her. He stood up and threw his bag over his shoulder, and I watched Price smile and her cheeks turn red. It was a real smile that made her cheeks raise and showed off her teeth. Then I noticed something different. "Your braces, you cut them off?" "Yeah," she said, turning to the computer. "Let's have a look then," I said. She rolled her eyes as if annoyed, then turned towards me. She gave the smallest smile, like I was a terrible joke. She looked so different. You look amazing," I said. I was telling the truth. She always looked amazing to me, even with this older, somewhat colder face. "Yeah, thanks," she said. Her phone beeped, and she looked at the message, and she revealed them new white teeth to the screen. She then made an exaggerated glance to her watch and said, "Oh dear, I've got to go, new timetable," whilst quickly logging off the computer. She picked up her bag and squeezed my shoulder, then she was gone. Not long after that, I was back in the sports building, in the corridor where the rotors were. It turned out there was no class for her that hour. She had just lied to me. The early year rolled on, and soon came along the half-term break. My dad had moved house, out of Gatesborough, to a picturesque village halfway between college. The village was beautiful, and it is today. It's been a little special to me. My dad's house is the last in the village. It stands alone and has a long garden stretching towards a willow tree, but it's beyond that where the real beauty lays. There, upon a riverbank, is the remains of a 17th century manor house, commonly referred to as the castle by the people of the village. The bricks are orange, and 2 remaining spire towers rise up. As the sun sets behind it every evening, it's one of the most beautiful sights you will ever see. Upon many tormented times I have sat beside that castle and watched the river looking for answers. There is a barn owl that lives close by, and is often seen perched on the highest point of the castle. Anyway, me and Price didn't message each other that much back then. When I asked her about it, she would say, "What's to talk about anymore?" The messages had not stopped completely, but were on an every 2-hour basis rather than a minute. Our college timetables clashed too. I didn't see her much at all anymore. I remember one day, sat in a popular sandwich shop on an hour break from class. I was alone in the queue when Jim Mackinson, better known as Mackie, the guy that threw the orange in Price's face point blank. By the way, over the course of the first year we became quite good friends, sharing a similar sense of humour as he opened up. He walked into the shop, up to the till, and asked for a bottle of Coke. This was acceptable decorum in the shop if you didn't want to pay for a sandwich, but I saw an opportunity for a joke. The place was busy, with about 6 people in front of me in the queue. I was at the back, and Mackie hadn't seen me. Excuse me," I commanded in his direction. Everyone's attention was on me. "Can you not see this queue?" I shouted. Everyone stared. They probably couldn't believe what they were witnessing, perhaps thinking, who is this psychopath, since Mackie was twice my size and doesn't look like the guy you'd want to mess with. I could see the smallest smile behind his acting angry eyes. He'd got the joke. "I don't give a crap," shouted Mackie. "What? Who do you think you are?" I said, walking up to him. Nobody could believe their eyes. Everyone had gone silent, probably thinking they were about to play witness to a murder. About a metre away from each other, we erupted into laughter. The shop breathed again. After a hug and a joke, I got back in the queue and got my sandwich. Then I joined him. I bit into my salty sausage sandwich and embraced the spicy mayonnaise that dripped down my chin. "How you been, mate? Never really see you anymore now," said Mackie. "Not too bad. Not going to lie, I preferred the old class. Wish I was still in it." "Yeah, it's where your mates are, really. At least you got Jester and Rick, though." "Yeah, them guys are great. It's a shame that every other person is a dick." "That bad?" "That's harsh. It's mainly them football academy lads. Just putting everyone down all the time." "Yeah, they come across as idiots. I'd love to crack one of them." "Haha, me too, mate." "How are things in your class?" I asked Mackie. "Not too bad. It was funny when you and Jester were there, but I guess... well, everything just moves on, I guess," I said, interrupting him. "Yeah. How's Price doing?" "Price?" he said, looking a little surprised. "She's doing okay." "You sure? Can I be honest?" "Yeah, what happened?" "No, nothing like that. It's just, well, she spends a lot of time with that Ross." "Who?" "Ross Mully," said Mackie. I knew who the guy was. A quiet guy who had been one of my replacements. "Does she? Like, what do they get up to?" "You know, just sit together, laughing, joking." "Really? I guess Price does prefer the company of guys," I said, looking for the breadcrumbs in front of me. "Yeah, man, nothing to worry about really," said Mackie, looking like he wished he never brought it up. One evening after college, me and Price was at the bus station. My usual friends had got the usual bus to Gatesborough. We were getting the one after, that visited all the villages before Gatesborough, to the one my dad now lived in. The village bus rolled into the station, and it was different from the usual blue bus in every way. It was a horrible brown, and looked at least 20 years older. On the inside, the fabric seats were the colour of rust. I guess dirt doesn't show up well against the colour of crap. The atmosphere was different too. There was barely a person on it. This wasn't a bad thing, because the blue bus was loud and often brutal. This one was like a moving library. Me and Price paid our money and made our way to the back seat. Soon we were joined by a guy called Chris Conway. He was from Gatesborough, and I wasn't sure why he'd opted to get this bus. Perhaps he preferred the quiet. He smiled and we said hi. The bus started up, and soon after we were riding through the countryside on a warm evening. Price found herself in full conversation with Chris, asking him a lot of questions until he told her he was going to listen to his music. Soon we were approaching my village, and I pressed the stop button and waved to Chris. So did Price. The driver dropped us off, almost outside my door. We walked around the back way, and I told Price to look down the garden. She saw the castle and said it was pretty. I gave her a little tour of the house, and she didn't say much. I remember it was surprisingly beautiful that evening, so I slipped on our loyal hound's blue collar and decided to take him for a walk. "Come on," I said to Price. "I want to show you something." We walked through the little picturesque English village with a pooch pulling the way. He knew all too well where we was taking him. We walked past a cottage-like pub in the centre of the village and took a right. We walked down a wide path that led to the village green. There, in front of us, spanned out the lushest, greenest grass you have ever seen beneath the bluest sky. In the centre was a little pond, guarded by a lone, huge willow tree blowing gently in the breeze. I opened the wooden gate and unhooked the hound. He charged forward and absorbed the lush green under his thundering paws. His joy was evident from his open mouth that looked like a wide smile and his legs that did not know where to go first. He would dance, pause, then out of nowhere look at me, then off like in a crazy run. "Nice, isn't it?" I said to Price. "It's actually beautiful." A little later, me and Price sat on the bench that overlooked the pond, but we did not speak. We used to sit next to each other and not speak, and once the silence was comforting, but now the distance between us had gotten too far. Now it felt like literally something was between us, stopping us getting close to one another. Neither of us spoke about it, but we could feel it there now. The only noise was that of the breeze and the absence of the flowing words. Silence revealed the truth. I watched my dog running for the sake of running. As he got closer to Price, she put out her hand to touch him, but he ignored her, stepped aside and came to me. He looked up into my eyes, and with his big tongue panting, I could see him smiling. It was like he was saying thank you. He rubbed his head on my leg, and I scratched his ear. He then took a seat between my legs, and together we looked at the pond as I patted his big chest. I then looked at Price. Her eyes were glossy. I smiled and looked again at the water. I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it. But I'm sure if I looked a moment longer, I would have seen a tear rolling down her cheek. I can only wonder what she was thinking to make her cry. After a while, we walked to the far end of the village green and headed into a wooded area. The woods were quite big, about 10 acres. In there, my dog darted around the trees, and his paws broke many twigs and threw up many leaves. The trees were well separated, but still provided a good canopy above us. We didn't speak once, and soon we was heading back out into the light of the village green, and back to my house. At some point, I must have set up a Facebook account, because I remember seeing something as I sat in the sports building computer room surfing the web. I'm not sure if people were still using that term that year. It was quiet and I was alone. I navigated around the website, exploring, still really trying to figure it out, when I saw something, and it hurt. The power of this new realm struck me. There was a picture with a comment below. It drew emotion from me, a painful one. The picture was of Chris Conway, who I had seen the other day on the bus with Price. In it, he was topless, blatantly posing. That's fine, people can do what they want in front of the camera. What wasn't was the words below. "Nice," it said. Beside the comment was a picture of my girlfriend. It stunned me. My pre-internet, pre-social media perception of the world was trying to adjust to this new way of life. But I felt confused, and in some sense abused. In short, I didn't know what to think. What was the correct response? How was I supposed to feel? Was this okay? Obviously it wasn't, but back then I was still trying to figure out the rules. I think we all were. All I did know was this social media scared and fascinated me, and I promptly logged out. At some point in the next couple of days, I found myself alone. It was becoming a regular occurrence. It was partly due to not being in Price's class, but I had also begun to withdraw from most people. I spent increasing time with my music in my ears, filling in the gaps. I liked to be alone because I couldn't be with Price. At least I could think about her. On one of these alone moments, I had been on top of the sports building to hand in an assignment. I passed over my shoddy work I barely cared about and walked down the staircase. From there, I could see across the college grounds, and I could see a lot of my friends sat on the wall outside the main building. The sun was out, and I could see a lot of laughter. There was Rick, Jester, Wolfie, Shania, Ken, and 2 others, Price and Taz. Price was sat on Taz's lap. She looked small in his arms, and they both laughed together. They all laughed, teenagers in the sun, looking like they were never going to die. I stood at a distance, behind the glass. I couldn't hear them, I could just feel their smiles. It was obvious, but to me, a teenage dreamer who wanted to keep dreaming, it wasn't. I didn't want anything to end. I walked in the other direction. I headed back into the dark, deserted computer room like a little boy and imagined everything was okay. In the city is a stretch of modern glass buildings that overlook a waterfront. There's a cinema, some fancy restaurant, and for that summer only, there was Scream. It was a club. It was a strange place, because it appeared out of nowhere, and after a scandal, it disappeared just as quickly. People hold fond memories of the place. It's kind of a myth now. There was a downstairs and upstairs. In the downstairs, there was a good-sized bar with a pool table that played rock music. People would drink there on Friday and Saturday, and at a certain time upstairs would open. It was a dark and dirty dance floor, with a smaller bar and a surprisingly sticky floor. The music up there would be a blend of charts and the odd rock tune. Scream was extremely popular. The queue outside would stretch right down the waterfront that summer. It could easily be an hour wait to get in, unless you slipped the bouncer a 20. Scream was the place to be that summer. But back to me and Price. We did not speak much, but it came up that she was going to a friend from an old posh school who now lived on the college campus accommodation. Something must have gone seriously wrong in his life. He had dark spiky hair and was a bit of a rocker called Mike Hibbard. I had met him a couple times. He was alright. I knew they were just friends because Price wanted it that way, but I'm sure if Price had given him a chance, he would have taken it. Apparently, I had been invited to his place with Price as he was having a little get-together. That's how Price put it. So that Friday, I packed some going-out clothes and went to college. When our classes finished, me and Price walked to the student accommodation. I knew the building reasonably well after my visit to Robin Archer's. Soon, we were in Mike's little lounge, a tiny room with 2 sofas facing each other and a small grey TV between us. He put on some music and we cracked open some beers. He was okay, there was little threat. But Price didn't want to sit beside me. She sat opposite, to suspend herself perfectly between the attention. The conversation between me and Mike was tough, and he cared little for what I had to say. His eyes were always wandering back to Price. "Thanks for the beer, Mike, and let me stay. I'll buy you one when we're out," I said, trying to be polite. But I remember every time I spoke to him, he just looked awkward, gave me a weak smile and started talking to Price again. Soon the doorbell went. Mike went to let in the new guests. I remember looking at Price. There was a weird smile on her face. It just didn't seem right. She was looking down at her drink like a naughty child. And for the briefest of moments, I hoped to think everything could be okay between us. "You okay?" I said with a genuine smile. "Mm-hmm," she nodded. I heard a few voices and little laughter coming from the corridor and twisted my head to see our new visitors. First came in Darren Maston. I knew him rather well. He actually lived in the same village as my dad, and we'd spoken on the bus home a few times. "All right, Mercury, how are you?" he said, looking surprised as I was. "Not bad, mate. I didn't expect to see you here," I said, as his friend walked in. "All right, mate." It was Taz, nodding in my direction with a big smile. I said nothing. I watched him turn towards Price. I saw their instinctive eyes hold on to each other. Their smiles echoed. The only difference was she was blushing. "Price," said Taz. "Taz," said Price, smiling with big white teeth. We all sat together there in that little room. Taz had taken a seat next to Price and Darren sat next to me. The only two speaking was Darren and our host Mike. I looked at the opposite sofa. It hurt. Taz sat with his legs wide open and his arms stretched out over the top of the sofa. One was behind Price. They both kept glancing at me, and somehow I felt like I was intruding. "What time are we heading out?" said Darren, finishing his third beer. "I think we should go out soon. We don't want to get there late. 1, because of the queue, and 2, we might have to pay," said Mike, standing up, looking down at us. "Agreed?" "Sure," said Taz. "Cool," I said. I changed into my black polo top and applied a little more hair wax. Then the 5 of us headed out with beer in hand. It was still very light when we got to Scream, and we sat at a table beside the bar's big window looking out at the waterfront. I had a couple of pints as the light faded, and I felt a little better. Somehow being in the bar, in a more neutral area, I felt more at ease. But that applied to everyone. Taz sat opposite me again. He was drinking his third pint and spilling it as he laughed. Price sat behind him as conversation flowed in all directions when Taz said, "Yeah, I did a massage course last year. The teacher always said I was going to be good because of my big hands, see?" he said, holding out his hand. "So you're a masseuse then?" said Price. "I guess so," said Taz, smiling. "Show me," said Price, turning her back to him. "Come closer," he said, pulling her in, putting his big hands around her waist, helping her get close to him. He then put his hands on her shoulders and began to work his thumbs into her back. "Oh God, that's amazing," said Price, closing her eyes. "Just relax," said Taz. Darren turned and tried to talk to me about something. About what, I haven't got a clue, but I acted interested as I watched my girlfriend moaning in pleasure as another man handled her. After a few minutes the massage stopped, and then Taz turned to me and said, "Do you want to have a go, Daniel?" he said with a big grin. "No." Our group got a little drunk and began to separate. About an hour later I was near the bar talking to somebody I barely knew from Gatesborough. I don't remember their name, I just remember it being a guy. I remember him standing near the pillar with an electric jukebox on it, and it was a touchscreen that boasted about thousands and thousands of songs you could choose for just 20 pence. It had been a few hours since I had entered the bar, and it had become rammed, but as I spoke to my town compatriot, it was getting emptier. I realised then they must have opened the upstairs, the dirty dance floor. After speaking probably far too loud, It was what I do after a few drinks. I said goodbye and took my trip upstairs. I walked past the bar, a bit wobbly, and headed to the door that led upstairs. Standing there was a bouncer, a meathead in a sleeveless shirt and black waistcoat that looked ready to burst. He looked me up and down and decided I hadn't had enough, so he let me pass. I ascended the staircase, holding extra tight to the banister. It was an upward brick tunnel painted light blue. To my right was the occasional ripped poster of famous albums. I think I saw a yellow Sex Pistol one and a Pink Floyd Prism. Not that I was paying much attention. The closer I got to the top, the louder the music got, and I could feel the bass. I pushed open the door and was hit by the sound and the flashing lights. I stepped onto the sticky dance floor and watched girls in little clothing and all kinds of hair colours walk past me. The place smelt of sweat. In front of me was a busy bar where people swarmed. To my right was a dance floor. It was already full, and I watched silhouettes dancing as lights from the DJ set shone behind them. To my left was a black leather sofa and chairs. Beyond them was the toilets. I went and stood by the sofas and looked at the club in its entirety. It was strange, an underground scene gone mainstream, literally gone upstairs. A lot of guys had long hair and some even wore eyeliner. Girls wore a lot of leather, and hair colour didn't seem to have a norm. But amongst this crowd was misfits intertwined with your usual people, like the football goons in a small t-shirts showing off their gym gains, and girls who plastered themselves in makeup showing off their short skirts and breasts. It was a place where social norm and social fringe blended. Here there was no prejudice, there was no normal. It was a place where you lost yourself and pleasantly forgot forgotten. I went to the bar and got served quickly, spotting where my best chance was, a superpower I have always seemed to have. I paid and walked away with a bottle of warm beer and looked back at the dance floor. As I sipped the drink, I saw Price. I could tell she was drunker than I had ever seen her before. She was shouting with her arms up in the air on the dance floor. It's strange how at key moments of life we remember specific details. Sometimes it's a smell. In this case, it was a song. It was Wiz Khalifa and it was called Black and Yellow. What happened next would mean I would hate that song for years after. I noticed she was dancing with Taz. They sang into each other's faces and she ran her hands down his chest. She moved her hips and danced sexier than I knew she could. His hands moved on her. In the next moment, her legs wrapped around his waist. His hands were on her back underneath her clothes. Her hands were wrapped around his neck. They moved to the music, holding each other's eyes as all I could hear was black and yellow, black and yellow, black and yellow. Then her head moved towards his and their noses touched. I tore my eyes away from the scene and breathed deeply. The reaction was instant, something physical. I cried. I moved to the seated area and sat with my head down, trying to hide my tears, not wanting to be seen. The crying was real. Tears fell from my long eyelashes and I couldn't fight it. I didn't want to. It had to come out. My 18-year-old self wasn't sure what he had seen, but it hurt the core. I wiped away my tears with the occasional swear word to ease the pain, but then just sat there. My idea of the world was trying to readjust itself. It needed something to hold. I whispered to myself, "It's over." That helped a little, like a little tiny dose of morphine. Then another song came on. It was Blink-182, All the Small Things. I downed my bottle and began to nod my head. "Come on," I told myself. I headed towards the bar, careful not to look at the dance floor, and sang to myself, not caring what anybody thought about me. Na 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 na. I screamed to the music. I got 2 more bottles of beer and downed one at the bar. I was in a euphoric misery. I turned towards the dance floor and looked at long hair and green eyes I knew all too well. It was Mackie. Without words he put his arms around me and we jumped to the music. I joined the crowd of bodies on the sticky floor. I wasn't having a good time. I was fighting back. I drank more and danced and danced. The songs changed but the emotions did not. I wore my drunken facade and smiled till the music stopped. The whole time I didn't see Price. I walked through the city night, past the blue lagoon that reflected the dirty red and white lights of the nightclub, under a black sky with dotted stars that swirled like I'd fallen into the Van Gogh masterpiece. In the distance across the city, the floodlights were calling me. They illuminated the Gothic cathedral. I followed its call. I knew the college accommodation was close to it. As I walked through the silent city, eventually I heard noise. My phone. I rummaged my jean pocket and pulled it out and looked at the little screen above the buttons. I clicked an open read. It was from Price. It said, "Over." The word was empty. I felt nothing. When I saw her leg wrapped around another man, my feelings had been removed. I could take no more beating. so I stumbled along, closing one eye, and messaged back. I'm nearly there. Can you open the door when I'm back? Slowly, a minute passed before I received her reply. She replied, No, you can't stay here. I replied, I have nowhere else to go, please. Price replied, fuck's sake. I was near the college, and a little wobbly, emotionally and physically. I approached the door and raised my hand to knock, but the door opened and a light hit me. Price was there, but I didn't see her face as she turned too quickly. Be quiet, she hissed, walking away. She was in her shortish shorts and vest top. I watched her bronze skin and brown hair walk away from me, down the corridor and disappear into the lounge area. Seeing her dressed that way was strange. It didn't seem right, that she wasn't in her own house. I stepped in and closed the door quietly behind me and tiptoed into the lounge area. On the floor, laying on his back, with his legs sprawled on a pillow and a blanket, was Taz on the floor. His eyes were closed and one hand was down his pants. On the other sofa was Darren. He was also asleep and snoring. I watched Price take her place on the floor also. She didn't look at me once. She just got under another blanket several feet away from Taz. I went for the other sofa, climbed on it and rested my weary head. Maybe half an hour passed. Darren's snoring eased off and everything was almost silent. I had my eyes closed and was uncomfortable, in more sense than one. But I didn't want to move. I didn't want to break the delicate equilibrium of the room that I hated. Then I heard kissing. A wet separation of lips, and then again. I allowed it to happen, just to see if it was real. Then I heard a woman's moan and a man's whisper. It had to be. I shouted as loud as I could as I sat upright and punched the wall hard. As I jumped up, I stared down at Taz, whose eyes were closed. He was pretending to be asleep. Fuck you, I said, somehow resisting the urge to stamp on his head and remove his teeth with my heel. I headed for the door, pushed it open and banged it hard against the corridor wall. I walked out of the flat into the night without a clue what to do. I just had to leave. I walked down the long straight path that headed out of the college. There was little thought, just anger and instinct moving me along. I headed towards the usually busy road that wasn't so busy at 4 a.m, and I heard a voice from behind me. Daniel, what are you doing? Shouted Price. I stood alone in the dark path. I breathed deeply, closed my eyes and then turned. She walked up to me and repeated herself. What's the matter with you? I didn't answer. I just looked at her big, lying, innocent, evil eyes. I looked at a face I once knew, as my own eyes glistened and my chin wobbled. We weren't doing anything, she said, filling a silence she hated so much, a silence that shone the light on her guilt. Don't, I said in a breathy whisper. It's all I could manage. I could barely look at her as I moved to the nearby wall and sat down. Honestly, we didn't, she said. Her lie was embarrassing. I don't care that you don't want to be with me. That's fine. But don't do this. At least wait, I said. She sat down on the wall beside me and stared at the ground. We said nothing for a minute. Just do one last thing for me, I said. She looked at me properly for the first time that night. Sleep with me on the sofa tonight. What? Please. For God's sake, please. Okay, she said with disdain. We walked back in no way together. We re-entered and Price lay beside me on that tiny sofa. I felt her there, her warm skin on mine, her heart beating, but I felt nothing. I think it was at that moment. I was spooning her, and I remember my hand resting on her shoulder, my knuckles against her soft neck. I wanted to turn my hand around and wrap my fingers around her throat. I wanted to squeeze hard and listen to the silence, but I didn't. I just imagined it vividly. I imagined her face screaming but with no noise coming out. I imagined her turning blue. When she fell asleep, I rested my hand on her throat gently. How good it felt. I stayed like that until the sun came up, and at first light I left the room, feeling like I had lost myself. The sun hadn't been up long, and I walked to the local park where I had once done the bleep test. I walked the tree-lined corridor, and a couple of people passed me, both middle-aged women with raincoats on, walking their dogs. The dogs seemed to be smiling, but paid me little attention. The air was cool, and the sky was full of thin clouds. I walked extremely slowly, with my hands in fists, and at times I had to steady my breathing. How could she? That was my main thought. I relived the night before, on a sofa listening to my girlfriend kissing another man, and I was right there. How? I asked myself. How could a person do such a thing? Who does she think she is? What would I be if I accepted that? I was biting my lip. I stopped walking and wanted to scream. I wanted to punch the concrete floor until my knuckles broke. I wanted to rip out my hair. A fire began to blaze in my mind, and I punched myself on the cheek hard. Then again harder. I hated myself. I hated her, and I began to shake and whisper, "No." I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breaths. We can't let people treat us like this way. Never. I nodded and even smiled, deciding I will not let her defeat me. I told myself I'm far too self-aware to allow a teenage whore to curse my mind, body and soul. I turned and in the distance could see the two middle-aged women with their dogs. They looked back occasionally as they walked. I then wiped away a tear I didn't even realise until it touched my lips. I walked back into the room where it all happened. My bag was still there. In there was Price. She sat alone on the sofa in her pyjamas. Opposite was Taz and Darren, both wearing the clothes from the night before. The TV was on, playing some awful daytime chat show, where people go on TV to row in front of the nation. "Alright mate, you have a good night," said Taz, weirdly sounding genuine. His eyes were a little too fixated on mine. I smiled so slightly and shrugged. Price looked at me with big eyes too, with a face that looked concerned. I sat down on the sofa beside Price. I sat as far away from her as possible, and then she did something strange. She moved towards me, leant against me, and rested a hand on my leg. I felt sick. I wasn't sure if it was the hangover. I wanted to push her away. I wanted to do things worse than that. I felt like a child's plaything, and humiliation rippled through me. It was a weird humiliation, not the kind that turned your face red. I wanted to bite her ear, and as the screams began, to kick Taz in the jaw and feel his bones crush against my laces. But I didn't. I needed some more time. I sat still, and she went to hold my hand. But I could take it no longer. "I'm going to go," I said, letting go of her hand and standing up. "Give me a second," said Price, standing up and leaving the room to presumably get changed. I didn't really understand what was happening, but I waited. I looked at the other sofa, and both Taz and Darren were staring at me. Then Darren looked back towards the TV as I looked at him. "It was good seeing you last night, mate," said Taz. I just stared at him. After the first 5 seconds, he knew he wasn't going to get the answer he wanted, so he pretended to watch the TV. I kept staring and began to wonder how white his skull was. "Let's go," said Price, in a pair of jeans and black vest top, looking rejuvenated. We went to the main college library. It was a Saturday, so it was basically empty. We sat together in front of a computer browsing the web. Price sat close and was attentive. She kept trying to hold my hand. It took me about an hour to realise what was happening. Guilt. I concluded whatever teenage curiosity she had last night got the better of her because she was drunk. But now, in the day of light, shame cast an ugly shadow on her soul and she didn't like it. So she tried to banish it. When she looked at me, she saw something safe, the same way a fat man looks at an old sofa he'd been sitting on for 10 years. Finally, I could take it no more. "What happened last night?" I said. She looked down at the floor. Her long brown hair almost covered her face completely. "I don't understand, just because—" "Don't," she said, interrupting me. "Excuse me?" "Don't. It's just too painful," she said slowly, looking up. Her green eyes looked almost possessed, as she put her finger on my lip and smiled ever so slightly. I looked at her face. It seemed that every detail cast a shadow upon itself. Her face looked dark and her smile was somehow horrifying. She looked like a fallen angel demanding love. "So, I just have to pretend it never happened," I said. That horrifying smile disappeared. She bit her lip and nodded slowly. She then let out this laugh. It sounded like a toddler's and a pervert's all at the same time. She turned back towards the computer, and all I could do was stare. "You coming to mine tonight?" she said, looking at the computer screen. I stared at the grey carpet below me. That's when I knew what I had to do. As I looked at the side of her head, I saw something I hated. The idea was instant. Even though I hadn't completely figured it out, I had a rough idea of what I needed to do. There was just two things. I realised then if I acted quickly, I could get the first one done that night. "Are you at work tonight?" I said. She turned to me and smiled. "Only for a couple hours. It doesn't matter, does it?" "No, I suppose not. I can come over if you want me to." "Yeah, of course. Oh, I knew you'd come round," she said, kissing me on the lips and turning back to the computer. I could see by her smile she thought she had won. But she didn't have a clue. I wanted revenge. The whole journey back, Price acted like nothing had happened. She was attentive and often tried to hold my hand and smile. She actually acted more like the old Price, the one who wanted me. I smiled back, but my mind harboured thoughts so dark I struggled to contain them. Many a time on that journey I found myself just glaring at her, and I had to shake myself and tell myself to calm down. Later that evening I found myself in the spare room laid on the bed. Price was walking around the room, making her last preparations for work as I relaxed in front of her TV. She came over to the bed and smiled at me with white teeth and sat on the side of the bed and took my hand. "Look, thanks a lot for coming over, it means a lot," she said, looking very beautiful. "It's fine." She bit her lip and looked like she was struggling with something. I imagined the guilt in her stomach was taking one last bite. She looked up at the ceiling and I could see tears behind her eyes. She let out a sad smile and kissed me on the cheek and left the room. I listened to her footsteps down the stairs and head out the front door, open and shut. As I sat there was only one thing I was thinking. Still no apology, and she never will. It was then I heard lighter footsteps coming up the stairs. Big blonde hair past the open door. Price's sister looked in from the side of her eyes and saw me laying there. I noticed then a small smile on her face as she walked into her room. She pushed the door open wide, and I looked in. It was no longer messy. She disappeared for a moment, and I couldn't see her, and then she re-emerged. She was topless again, and I was surprised by her breasts. She smiled at me with the most wonderful smile, and I smiled back, and we were almost laughing at each other as she coyly looked to the ground in a beautiful shame. I then got off the bed, walked towards her room, and she watched me with every step with big blue eyes. As I got closer, I watched her smile grow, and then I closed her bedroom door behind me. Later that night, as everyone slept, I was laid in bed with Price, with all the lights turned off. The house was silent. The room was cool, and she turned to me, and she pushed her bum into me. She pulled down her little shorts, and I gripped her neck. I squeezed her hard, but never kissed her once. Mentally, I let go, and I made her make noises I had never heard before. I got off the bus on Sunday and walked to the back of my house. My dad and stepmom was both in the kitchen. He was making homemade pizza. I'm sure I remember the smell of feta and caramelised onions. "Hey Daniel, do you want some coffee making?" said my stepmom. "No thanks, I'm okay." "Did you have a good night Friday?" said my dad, turning away from the bread dough. Not too bad," I said, not able to look him in the eye whilst telling a lie. "By the way, me and your dad are going to my sister's in Sussex tomorrow, so we won't be here for a couple of nights, so you've got the place to yourself if that's okay," said my stepmom, filling up the kettle. "Yeah, cool, that's fine. As long as you don't mind looking after this guy," she said, as our dog skipped in right on cue. He sniffed my jeans at the knees and then rubbed his head against my thigh as if to say, "Welcome home." "Ha, always a pleasure," I said, scratching him behind the ear. "You know what? I think I'll take him for a walk now. I need to do a little thinking." "Yeah? Brilliant. His collar and leads next to the food in the conservatory," said my dad, handing me a small piece of feta, then giving some to the dog. "Pizza will be ready when you're back." Me and the hound walked to the village green under the darkening clouds. It was very early evening, but it seemed later because it was getting so dark. It had got cold too, and I was glad I had put on a jumper before I left. I sat on the bench in front of the pond, and in the silence my mind spoke to me. A wave of emotion moved through me. It came from the stomach and moved through my muscles. First, there was anger, then pity, then pain. They all mingled together. The overall taste was something close to confusion. Sat there, I felt very much like me, self-aware. All the emotions seemed to dissolve, and suddenly I could see a reality. From a distance, I could understand it better. I could see clearly. I concluded quickly someone had made a mockery of me. They used me. In their self-centered mind, me and everything else must be nothing. To her, people are to be harvested when hungry, then set alight when the time was right. I understood then, in life, we must look after ourselves. We must think for ourselves, and most of all, we must respect ourselves. How do I retain my self-respect? I pondered, in front of the pond. I looked across the village green and into the woodland at the end. From where I sat, it looked very dark. It was isolated from all the houses of the village. I took out my phone and messaged Price. "Hey, you okay? What are you doing tomorrow night? My parents are out and I wondered if you wanted to come round." I hit send, and after a short wait, looking at the cold water, my reply came. "Hey, kiss, kiss, kiss. That sounds amazing, gorgeous. Everything okay?" I replied, "Yeah, Just perfect. Smiley face, kiss, kiss, kiss. I put my phone in my pocket and looked at the woodland again. I smiled and called my dog, and we headed back home. When I got in, the pizza was waiting for me on the kitchen table. My dad and stepmom had finished theirs and were sitting in the living room. I got a glass of water and sat at the table as the pooch sat beside me and watched in amazement as I took my first bite. "Dad, yeah?" he called back from the living room. "Can Price come over tomorrow night?" "Yeah, that's fine," he said. "Thanks," I said as cheese dripped down my chin. The next morning I was woken by a slamming door. I stirred in my bed and realised it was my dad and stepmom leaving for Sussex. Knowing I was alone in the house, I walked through the kitchen in just my underwear and flicked on the kettle. As I listened to it boil, I looked through the kitchen window down the garden. I looked at the castle remains, the sun rose, and was impressed by its beauty. As I stood there, I felt the wet nose of my dog on my naked thigh. "Morning, boy," I said, opening the door in front of me, letting him out. The cold morning air felt refreshing on my body. I watched the dog sniff around on the dewy grass, and he picked the perfect place to take a dump. I went back in and got my coffee. Considering what I was preparing to do, I felt remarkably fresh and clear in mind. After a shower, and slipping into a pair of jeans and t-shirt, I walked to the garage underneath the blue morning sky. I opened it up and began to look for what I needed. I moved a couple of old bikes and slipped past the lawnmower to a shelf at the back. There was a green plastic toolbox on a workstation, and above that shelf, on there was what I needed. It was a clear plastic bag, and in it was black zip ties. I took the bag and looked around some more. I saw the other thing I needed, rope. It was quite thin, perhaps better described as thick string, but I unwinded some and pulled at it with both hands. It seemed strong, and there was plenty of it. I took the rope and zip ties and shut the garage door. I then whistled the dog to come back into the house. I put the zip ties and rope on the kitchen side, then opened the kitchen drawer. I took out a large knife and placed it beside the other items. I then put on my trainers and my dog became excited. "You're staying here, boy, but I won't be long. You'll get your walk later," I said, slipping my items into my college bag and leaving the house. Later that day, I stood on the village road under an afternoon sun. The gentle wind brought pollen in from the field behind me. I made my nose tingle and my eyes itch. I checked my phone. It was just after 4 p.m. Then the brown bus came into view and began to slow down. It hissed, then came to a stop right in front of me, and its door opened. Price stood there in a pink summer dress with flowers on it. It stopped above her knee and revealed long tanned legs. Her smile was perfectly white, and her skin radiated a warmth. As she stepped off the bus, her sandals slapped on the concrete floor. I'd never seen her look so feminine. She put her arms around me, and I could smell her perfume. I would have called it summer's dirty little secret. The bus door shut, and it noisily moved away, leaving us alone in the little English village. "Hey you," she said, stepping back. She stood there silently, like she wanted me to look at her, up and down. "Do you think I look nice?" "Of course I do. You look gorgeous," I said, looking at her. She let out that perverted toddler laugh and took my hand, and she led me to my house. As we walked there was a smile on her face. It said, "I'm your everything." As we walked in, the pooch trotted into the kitchen in a pleasant grace. He wanted to say hello to Price and sniffed her legs. "Ugh, get him away," she said, looking appalled. He wanted to say a real hello, and lifted his head, and his jowls left a little drool on her dress. She gave him a slap across the nose. "God's sake, look what he's done," she shouted at him. He jumped back and looked very surprised, sniffing her way with a paw raised tentatively. I reached for the kitchen towel. "Get him away, please," she shouted. "Come on, boy," I said. And he came to me, and I rubbed his chest, and he sat beside me as I handed Price a paper towel. "You hungry?" "I was thinking of making some pasta." "Pasta what?" she said, wiping away the drool. "Tuna and mayonnaise, put some sweet corn in it, maybe a little cheese." "I suppose," she said, not looking at me. "You know, you didn't have to hit him. He was only saying hello." "Well, I don't want to be drooled on. He bought this dress the other day." "Still, you hit him pretty hard. It's not something I would expect from my girlfriend." "What?" "Well, you didn't have to hit him." "No, not that," she said, smiling. "What?" "You called me your girlfriend," she said, really staring at me and smiling. "Yeah?" "I'm not your girlfriend, Daniel," she said, throwing the kitchen towel in the bin, laughing at me. "You're not?" "No. We established this the other night, remember? I messaged you." "So why are you here?" "Because you invited me." I thought, bless you. Well, you thought wrong, didn't you? Come on, she said, walking into the living room. A little later, I made the tuna mayonnaise, and we sat in the cool living room on blue leather sofas. We ate in silence. She seemed very comfortable, and we watched TV. I looked out the window and I could see grey clouds gathering in the sky. The time was about 6 p.m, and I knew if it started raining, I could miss my chance. I was thinking, said Price. What's that? I think we should go to your bedroom. Last time was amazing, she said, turning her body and putting her perfectly smooth legs on my lap. Her head tilted slightly, and that sick smile appeared. A hand ran up her thigh and disappeared under her dress as her eyes locked onto mine. You coming? She said. She seemed like a completely different person. I stood up and grabbed her ankles, and in one quick movement pulled her down the sofa so her head was below me. I leant in and kissed her on the lips, but she turned her face away, and she gave me that perverted laugh. I stood up and held back my own laughter. We have to do just one thing first. What's that? We need to take him for a walk, I said, looking at my wide-eyed hound. You can't be serious, she said, wiping that grin off her face. I can, and it looks like it's going to rain, so we need to be quick. We walked onto the village green as the first drops of rain began to fall. Oh, come on, let's go back, said Price. No, he's been out like a minute. Let's head up to the woods there. It'll be dry in there, I said. As we walked over to the thick grass, the rain began to fall hard. Oh God, shouted Price, getting soaked, wearing only her thin dress. We ran for the woods as the rain almost hurt the top of our heads. We made it into the woods and was out of the rain. It could be heard loudly on the leaves above us, and it was quite dark inside, but you could still see clearly. I looked at Price. Her hair looked almost black, and her dress was stuck to her and had gone see-through. She surprised me then. She started laughing as she wiped away the rainwater from her eyes. She stepped up to me and put her arms around my neck and looked deeply into my eyes. You know what this reminds me of? She said. What? The first time we kissed, remember? Her face went still and them green eyes held onto mine. Remember me doing this? She said, slipping her arms out of her dress and letting it fall to the floor. I looked at her almost naked body and thought it looked delicious in goosebumps and raindrops. Kiss me like you kissed me that day, she said, as condensation slipped from her lips. Her lips danced against mine, and her hands ran through my wet hair, but I barely moved. I felt like I wasn't there. What's the matter? She said, as our lips separated, making a kissing sound. You know what that reminds me of? I said coldly. What? A couple nights ago, when you were kissing another man. Another man as I was in the same room. I watched her face distort. What? She said, almost with anger. You heard me. Who was better, you little slut? Oh my God, she said, picking up her soaked dress, walking deeper into the woods. What's wrong? Don't want to talk about it? Well, I do, I said, following her. I'm not talking about that. Why? I shouted, as twigs broke beneath my feet. I said I'm not talking about it, she shouted, walking quicker. I got close to her, and her body seemed paler now against the earthy colours and dim light. Well, I do, I said, grabbing her wrist and pulling her back. Her body turned, so she was facing me. I don't know what she saw, but her anger vanished, and in a second I was looking into her big frightened eyes. Please don't do this. What did I do? What did I do? I was so nice to you, and you did that to me. Tell me, why? Why would you do that? I said, spitting. I watched her bottom lip tremble as she began to shiver. I remembered the way she held her own body. I did nothing, I said. That's when I suddenly grabbed her throat. She tried to talk, but she couldn't. I was squeezing as hard as I could. Her green eyes dulled, and her skin seemed to turn paler. She didn't struggle, which frustrated me, so I pushed her back and she stumbled to the ground. She got on her knees and began to crawl away. I remember hearing the sobs. Stop it! You're scaring me! You're scaring me! She said, gasping for breath. I watched her back shudder as she crawled through the dirt. Unknown to her, she was crawling towards my bag with the knife, rope and zip ties beneath a log. Please, I want to go home now, she said, still crying. I jogged past her, towards the log, grabbed the zip ties and walked back to her. She must have heard my footsteps because she looked over her shoulder. Daniel, please don't do anything, She made it that far when I slammed my foot into her spine and pinned her to the ground. I think I winded her because I remember her gasping. I grabbed her hands and pulled them behind her back. Then I took the zip tie and tied her hands together. I then walked back to the log and got the rope. I watched her struggling on the ground. She struggled to get on her back and eventually managed as I brought the rope towards her. I bent down to grab her foot and everything went dark. When the light came back on, I could smell dirt. My face was on the ground. I could hear the rain on the leaves above me. My jaw hurt, and as I sat up, I saw her naked running body in the distance with her hands tied behind her back. I got up and began to chase. She tripped in a panic, and without her hands to break the fall, she hit the ground hard. I got close and she began to scream. It came from the pit of her stomach and ripped through the woods. It almost touched my soul and redefined terror. She sat herself up in the mud. Her green eyes grew large. They watched me with an obsession as her mouth let out something that sounded like a wounded animal. "Stop, stop, stop," she said, like she was possessed. I wrapped the rope around her legs till it covered most of her shins. Then I grabbed her ankles and dragged her face first through the mud. It was harder than I thought, as I used both hands to pull her. Her crying slowed as I listened to her hope fade as her bra fell off. When I got near the log, I let go of her legs and looked down at her completely naked body. She looked like an unfinished mummy. Her crying was slow until I got the knife from underneath the log. I grabbed it and walked back to her and saw my dog just sitting there, 10 feet from Price. He looked at her with his head tilted, like a confused puppy. I then walked up to her, holding the knife tightly. "Look at me," I said. When I said it, she shut her eyes tightly. "Look at me!" I shouted. My voice seemed to echo through the woods. "I can't," she said, shuddering. "Fair enough," I said, stepping close to her. I realised then she was almost the perfect image that had been stuck in my head since the day I met her. That corpse in the woods. Maybe it was always meant to be her, I thought. As I got on my knees beside her, to end it all, to take back my respect, I heard him. A howl. I looked up. There was my dog. He was right in front of me, and he howled into the sky. As he brought down his head, he looked at me, then let out another shuddering, soul-changing cry. It was deep and echoed into the sky. It was the saddest sound I'd ever heard. Again, he let out another howl, and he watched me. Each time he looked like he was crying. It made me want to cry. As I looked down and saw the shivering naked girl below me and the knife in my hand, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I dropped the blade and began to step backwards. What? How? After a few minutes of gathering my thoughts, I went over to Price. My dog had stopped howling, and I turned to her and helped her sit up. She couldn't look at me. She was just shaking, looking frightened. I tried to say something, but I couldn't find the words. I helped her stand up and walked her to a nearby small tree. "I'm sorry," I said, not able to look her in the eye either. I sat her down at the tree trunk and took the rope, then began to wrap it around her in the tree. I went around it maybe a couple dozen times and tied a good knot so she was attached to the trunk. "Good night," I whispered, walking home. It was a long night, and it didn't stop raining. I remember in the middle of the night I got up and went to the back door. I opened it and thought about going to get her, but as I looked at the utter blackness, I realised I wouldn't be able to find her. I imagined her there, naked in the cold. I just shut the door and went back to bed, but I didn't fall asleep. I just thought about her there in the darkness, listening to the rain on the leaves above her. As we got onto the village green, I let the dog off the lead. We entered the woods, and I felt fearful. As we approached her, I was surprised to see how naked she was. Her head was down and her legs were flat out against the ground. Leaves stuck to her body, and I couldn't see her face. Her wet hair covered it. She didn't move. Her body was so pale for a moment I thought she was dead. "Price?" I said tentatively. She looked at me, but I could see her head moving so slightly. "I really am sorry," I said. Again there was just silence. I put her bag on the ground and took some scissors out. I began to cut at the rope around her legs. I just remember how cold they were. When I cut the last piece, she didn't kick out or anything. I then began to cut the rope from around her body. As she was cut free, she didn't move straight away. There's clothes in the bag, tracksuit bottoms and hoodie. The next bus should be here shortly if you want to get it. She sat there for about a minute, saying nothing. Then slowly she stood up. I still couldn't see her face properly. She didn't look at me or make any effort to cover herself up. She walked towards me, and I took a small step back, a little scared. But she didn't look at me. She just knelt down and grabbed her bag, then turned and began to walk towards the village green. Then she paused. She stood there for about a minute and turned back. It was a horrifying image. I stepped back again, and she walked over to my dog. She knelt down and kissed him on the head, and he licked her face. She let out a little laugh. It was full of pain and beauty. He sat there wonderfully knowing he was providing the love she needed. After a minute, she kissed him again and then walked away. As she walked, she took out the hoodie from the bag and slipped it on. Then, just before she stepped onto the village green, she put on the tracksuit bottoms. I watched her walk all the way past the pond through the gate. There, I sat on the dirt ground for about an hour. I looked for the knife but could never find it, which was strange, because I thought I knew exactly where I dropped it. When I got home, I sat on the blue sofa. The TV was off, and then I heard the living room door open beside me. I imagined a naked girl with a knife, but no. It was just my dog. He looked at me with his big panting grin, and I patted his big head. That whole summer, I waited for the police to turn up, but they never did. Why Price didn't go to the police, I guess I'll never know. I know the whole time you were listening to this, you thought I was going to kill her, but I didn't. It wasn't until the following summer I started murdering people. I guess I'm weak. The urge to watch people's lives end has become too much. I won't go too much into detail. Let's just say there's a lot. I guess I will know if my tale is a success if the police come knocking at my door. And if they do, I will confess everything and all the people I have killed. Thank you for listening.